From Third World to First, The Singapore Story 1965 to 2000, by Kuan Yew. Foreword, by Dr. Henry A. Kissinger. Foreword. Dr. Henry A. Kissinger. In the second half of the 20th century, the emergence of scores of new states has made international politics and economics truly global for the first time in history. At the same time, technology has made it possible for nearly every country to participate in events in every part of the world as they occur. Unfortunately, the explosion in information has not been accompanied by a similar increase in knowledge. The continents interact, but they do not necessarily understand each other. The uniformity of technology is accompanied by an implicit assumption that politics, and even cultures, will become homogenized. Especially, the long-established nations of the West have fallen prey to the temptation of ignoring history and judging every new state by the criteria of their own civilizations. It is often overlooked that the institutions of the West did not spring full-blown from the brow of contemporaries but evolved over centuries, which shaped frontiers and defined legitimacy, constitutional provisions, and basic values. But history does matter. The institutions of the West developed gradually while those of most new states were put into place in elaborated form immediately. In the West, a civil society evolved side by side with the maturation of the modern state. This made possible the growth of representative institutions which confined the state's power to those matters which society could not deal with by its own arrangements. Political conflicts were moderated by overriding purposes. Many post-colonial states have no comparable history. Tasks, which, in forward the West, were accomplished over centuries, must be completed in a decade or two and under much more complex circumstances. Where the common national experience is colonial rule, especially when the state comprises diverse ethnic groups, political opposition is often considered an assault on the political validity of the state rather than of a particular government. Singapore is a case in point. As the main British naval base in the Far East, it had neither prospect nor aspiration for nationhood until the collapse of European power in the aftermath of the Second World War redrew the political map of Southeast Asia. In the first wave of decolonization, Singapore was made part of Malaya until its largely Chinese population proved too daunting for a state attempting to define its national identity by a Malay majority. Malaya extruded Singapore because it was not yet ready to cope with so large a Chinese population or, less charitably, to teach Singapore the habits of dependence if it was forced back into what later became the Malaysian Federation. But history shows that normally prudent, ordinary calculations can be overturned by extraordinary personalities. In the case of Kuan Yew, the father of Singapore's emergence as a national state, the ancient argument whether circumstance or personality shapes events is settled in favor of the latter. Circumstances could not have been less favorable. Located on a sandbar with nary a natural resource, Singapore had in the 1950s a polyglot population of slightly over 1 million, today over 3 million, of which 75.4% was Chinese, 13.6% Malay, and 8.6% Indian. It adjoined in the south with Indonesia, with a population of over 100 million, now nearly double that, and in the north with Malaya, later Malaysia, with a then population of 6.28 million. By far the smallest country in Southeast Asia, Singapore seemed destined to become a client state of more powerful neighbors, if indeed it could preserve its independence at all. Kuan Yew thought otherwise. Every great achievement is a dream before it becomes reality, and his vision was of a state that would not simply survive but prevail by excelling. Superior intelligence, discipline, and ingenuity would substitute for resources. Kuan Yew summoned his compatriots to a duty they had never previously perceived, first to clean up their city, then to dedicate it to overcome the initial hostility of their forward 11 neighbors and their own ethnic divisions by superior performance. The Singapore of today is his testament. Annual per capita income has grown from less than $1,000 at the time of independence to nearly $30,000 today. It is the high-tech leader of Southeast Asia, the commercial entrepot, the scientific center. Singapore plays a major role in the politics and economics of Southeast Asia and beyond. This volume is Lee Kuan Yew's account of his extraordinary achievement. He navigated this passage by understanding not only the requirements of his own society but the needs and motives of his neighbors. A thoughtful discussion of Indonesia and the fall of its President Suharto is matched by Lee Kuan Yew's account of his encounters with China and its leaders. His narrative of Singapore's abortive venture into creating a satellite city in Suzhou is particularly instructive on the challenge of melding the market economics of even so friendly an interlocutor as Singapore with the political and social realities of a China midway between Mao and reform. Lee Kuan Yew would not be true to himself were he less than frank about his analysis of the difference between the individualism of the West and the priority for social cohesion in countries such as his and in much of the rest of Asia. He does not ask us to change our patterns, only to refrain from imposing them on societies with different histories and necessities. These views have subjected Lee Kuan Yew to considerable criticism in the West. Those of us who prize our values while understanding the complexities of a new country in a different culture are prepared to leave it to history to pass judgment as to whether there were other options available to him. But, for a generation, every American leader who has dealt with Lee Kuan Yew has benefited from the fact that, on international issues, he has identified the future of his country with the fate of the democracies. And he has done so not passively but by making a seminal political contribution to the struggles of our time.
Preface. Written by the author, Lee Kuan Yew. Preface. I wrote this book for a younger generation of Singaporeans who took stability, growth, and prosperity for granted. I wanted them to know how difficult it was for a small country of 640 square km with no natural resources to survive in the midst of larger, newly independent nations all pursuing nationalistic policies. Those who have been through the trauma of war in 1942 and the Japanese occupation, and have taken part in building a new economy for Singapore, are not so sanguine. We cannot afford to forget that public order, personal security, economic and social progress, and prosperity are not the natural order of things, that they depend on ceaseless effort and attention from an honest and effective government that the people must elect. In my earlier book, I described my formative years in pre-war Singapore, the Japanese occupation, and the communist upheavals followed by racial problems during our 2 years in Malaysia. The Japanese occupation, 1942 to 1945, filled me with hatred for the cruelties they inflicted on their fellow Asians, aroused my nationalism and self-respect, and my resentment at being lorded over. My 4 years as a student in Britain after the war strengthened my determination to get rid of British colonial rule. I returned to Singapore in 1950, confident of my cause, but ignorant of the pitfalls and dangers that lay ahead. An anti-colonial wave swept me and many others of my generation. I involved myself with trade unions, 14 preface in politics, formed a political party, and at the age of 35 assumed office in 1959 as the first Prime Minister of an elected government of self-governing Singapore. My friends and I formed a united front with the communists. From the start we knew that there would have to be a parting of the ways and a time for reckoning. When it came, the fight was bitter, and we were fortunate not to have been defeated. We believed the long-term future for Singapore was to rejoin Malaya, so we merged with it to form Malaysia in September 1963. Within a year, in July 1964, we suffered Malay-Chinese race riots in Singapore. We were trapped in an intractable struggle with Malay extremists of the ruling party, United Malay National Organization, UMNO, who were intent on a Malay-dominated Malaysia. To counter their use of communal riots to cow us, we rallied the non-Malays and Malays throughout Malaysia in the Malaysian Solidarity Convention to fight for a Malaysian Malaysia. By August 1965, we were given no choice but to leave. The communal bullying and intimidation made our people willing to endure the hardships of going it alone. That traumatic experience of race riots also made my colleagues and me even more determined to build a multiracial society that would give equality to all citizens, regardless of race, language, or religion. It was an article of faith which guided our policies. This book covers the long, hard slog to find ways of staying independent and making a living without Malaysia as our hinterland. We had to work against seemingly insuperable odds to make it from poverty to prosperity in 3 decades. The years after 1965 were hectic and filled with anxiety, as we struggled to find our feet. We were relieved when we found in 1971 that we had created enough jobs to avoid heavy unemployment even though the British withdrew their forces from Singapore. But only after we weathered the international oil crisis in 1973, with the quadrupling of oil prices, were we confident that we could make it on our own. Thereafter, it was hard work, planning, and improvising to establish ourselves as a viable nation linked by trade and investments to the major industrial countries, and as a successful hub for the dissemination of goods, services, and information in our region. Our climb from a per capita GDP of $400 in 1959, when I took Preface 15 office as Prime Minister, to more than $2,200 in 1990, when I stepped down, and $22,000 in 1999 took place at a time of immense political and economic changes in the world. In material terms, we have left behind our third world problems of poverty. However, it will take another generation before our arts, culture, and social standards can match the first world infrastructure we have installed. During the Cold War in the 1960s and 1970s, when it was far from clear which side would win, we aligned ourselves with the West. The Cold War divide made for a simpler international environment. Because our immediate neighbors were against the communists, we enjoyed both regional solidarity and international support from America, Western Europe, and Japan. By the late 1980s, it was clear we were on the side of the victors. This is not a how-to book whether to build an economy, an army, or a nation. It is an account of the problems my colleagues and I faced, and how we set about solving them. I wrote my earlier book as a chronological narrative. To do so for this volume would have made the book too long. I have written by themes to compress 30 years into 700 pages.
Acknowledgements. Andrew Tan Kok Kyong started research for these memoirs in 1995. He was an officer in the Singapore Administrative Service, seconded to Singapore Press Holdings, SPH, to help me. The Prime Minister, Goh Chok Tong, allowed me access to all records and documents in the government ministries and in the archives. The registry officer in the Prime Minister's office, Florence Le Che King, and her assistants, Wendy Teo Kui Jik and Vijayan Thimala, were tireless and thorough in tracing files and documents. With the help of Pang Gek Chu, who worked for the Straits Times, and Alan Chong, a young political science graduate, Andrew searched through government records, minutes of important meetings, correspondence, and other relevant documents. Most useful were the notes I dictated immediately after meetings and conversations. Andrew Tan was able and resourceful. He coordinated the work of the researchers, organized the material, and made my task easier. Pang Gek Chu was quick and efficient in tracing reports of events and speeches in the Straits Times Library and Archives. In 1997, when the work expanded, Walter Fernandez and Yvonne Lim from SPH and Dr. Goh R. Ting from the National University of Singapore, NUS, joined my researchers. Panaselvan from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs helped retrieve records of my dealings with foreign leaders. Lily Tan, director of the National Archives, produced many useful documents and oral history transcripts of those who had allowed me to read them. The staffs at the 15 LL Acknowledgements NUS Library, the National Library, and the Straits Times Editorial Library were always helpful. John Dickey, former diplomatic correspondent of the Daily Mail, gave much valuable advice, especially on what would interest a British reader. My good friend Gerald Hensley, New Zealand's former High Commissioner in Singapore and later Secretary for Defence, gave good suggestions. Straits Times writers, Ching Yip Seng, Editor-in-Chief, Han Fuk Kwong, Warren Fernandez, Zuraida Ibrahim, Irene Ng, and Chua Mui Hung proposed many changes, making the book easier to read, especially for those without background knowledge of the events I described. Lim Jin Kun, editor of Zhaobao, read through the whole draft before its translation into Chinese. Seng Han Thong, formerly of Zhaobao, now in the National Trades Union Congress, NTUC, went through many versions of the drafts before finally settling the Chinese translation. Guntur Sadali, editor of Berita Harian, Minister for Community Development, Abdullah Tarmugi, Senior Parliamentary Secretary Zainul Abidin Rashid, and Parliamentary Secretaries Mohammad Maidin and Yaakob Ibrahim gave their views on all the chapters relating to Malays. I wanted to avoid unintentionally hurting Malay sensitivities and have tried hard not to do so. Old friends and colleagues, Goh Keng Swee, Lim Kim San, Ong Pang Boon, Othman Wak, Lee Koon Choi, Rahim Ishak, Maurice Baker, Sim Ki Boon, S.R. Nathan, now our president, and GM Tong Dao, read various parts of my drafts and corrected or confirmed my recollection of events. My drafts were also read by Kishore Mahbubani, permanent representative to the United Nations, Chan Hang Chi, ambassador to Washington, Bilahari Kausikan, deputy secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Tommy Koh, ambassador at large, and Lee Sao Yuan, director of the Institute of Policy Studies. Their valuable advice as diplomats, writers, and academics helped me give the book a better focus. Shova Low, line editor in Times Editions, meticulously cleaned up the final draft. My three personal assistants, Wong Lin Ho, Lo Hock Tek, and Ko Kiang Che, worked tirelessly, often late into the evenings, to take in Acknowledgements 19 every amendment and check for accuracy. They went well beyond the call of duty. To all of them and others too numerous to name, I express my grateful thanks. The errors and shortcomings that remain are mine. As with the first volume, my wife, Chu, went through every page many times until she was satisfied that what I had written was clear and easy to read. The line editor at HarperCollins, New York, has meticulously Americanized my English. She has also made me politically gender correct. Wherever I wrote man, he has become person or people. I thank her for making me appear less of a male chauvinist to Americans.
Part 1. Getting the Basics Right. Chapter 1. Going It Alone. 1. Going it alone. There are books to teach you how to build a house, how to repair engines, how to write a book. But I have not seen a book on how to build a nation out of a disparate collection of immigrants from China, British India, and the Dutch East Indies, or how to make a living for its people when its former economic role as the entrepot of the region is becoming defunct. I never had expected that in 1965, at 42, I would be in charge of an independent Singapore, responsible for the lives of its 2 million people. From 1959, when I was 35, I was Prime Minister of a self-governing state of Singapore. We joined the Federation of Malaysia in September 1963. There were fundamental disagreements over policies between Singapore and the federal government. All of a sudden, on August 9, 1965, we were out on our own as an independent nation. We had been asked to leave Malaysia and go our own way with no signposts to our next destination. We faced tremendous odds with an improbable chance of survival. Singapore was not a natural country but man-made, a trading post the British had developed into a nodal point in their worldwide maritime empire. We inherited the island without its hinterland, a heart without a body. Foreign press comments immediately after independence, all predicting doom, added to my gloom. One writer compared Britain's withdrawal from its colonies to the decline of the Roman Empire, when law and order collapsed as the Roman legions withdrew and barbarian hordes took over. Dennis Warner wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald, August 10, 1965, N. Independent Singapore was not regarded as viable 3 years ago. Nothing in the current situation suggests that it is more viable today. In the London Sunday Times, August 22, 1965, Richard Hughes wrote, Singapore's economy would collapse if the British bases costing more than £100 million sterling were closed. I shared these fears but did not express Kem. My duty was to give the people hope, not demoralize Kem. Indeed, one question uppermost in my mind was how long the British would or could keep their bases in Singapore. Would their stay be shortened because of the way separation had taken place? Harold Wilson was already facing opposition from his backbenchers. The East of Suez policy was costly and did not help the Labour government win votes. They needed the money for welfare and ochre vote-winning programs. The only guarantor of security and stability in East Asia, the United States, was deeply mired in a guerrilla war in Vietnam which was extremely unpopular with their European allies and with African and Asian governments. Anti-American propaganda by the Soviets and the People's Republic of China was most effective in the Third World. I felt it would be politically costly, if not impossible, for Singapore to have the Americans' cake over the role of the British. Australia and New Zealand on their own would not be credible guarantors. I feared that slowly but inexorably British influence would decline and American influence expand. For my generation born and bred in empire, it was not an easy change. I had to come to terms with American power without a British buffer. The British had enforced their will with a certain civility. The Americans were different, as I could see from the way they dealt with South Vietnamese leaders, and even with Thai and Filipino leaders who were not in as parlous a position as Cho's in Saigon. America was a power on the ascendant with bulging muscles and a habit of flexing chem. There was the personal burden of tighter security. It was irksome. Immediately after separation, the police officer in charge of my security had warned me that I had become the #1 hate object in the Malaysian Malay language newspapers and radio and television broadcasts, then circulating and receivable in Singapore. He advised me to move from my home on Oxley Road until they had made certain alterations to the house. I had a thick layer of security men instead of just one officer. He also extended discreet security cover for my wife Chu and the children. The threat from racial fanatics was unpredictable, unlike that from the communists who were rational and calculating and would see no benefit in going for Chu or our children. For 3 to 4 months, Chu and I stayed at Changi Cottage, a government chalet by the sea, near the RAF Changi airfield and inside a protected area. During that time, I held cabinet meetings irregularly. For the drive to my office at City Hall caused traffic disruption with the unaccustomed motorcycle outriders and a security car. I took urgent decisions by telephone conference with the relevant ministers which gave me relief from interminable office meetings. My personal assistants and Wong Chui-san, my trusted cabinet secretary, came every day to the cottage from where I worked. Within walking distance was a 9-hole RAF golf course that provided a welcome break from the daily grind of papers and minutes. I would play 9 holes, sometimes with a friend, at other times on my own, with Chu walking to keep me company. Our 3 children had to attend school, so they stayed at home and put up with the inconvenience of workers erecting a wall of bricks set in honeycomb pattern to screen off our front porch from the road. As a temporary measure, until bulletproof glass could be obtained, they also blocked our windows with steel plates. This made the rooms feel like prisons, and the whole family felt a tremendous sense of relief when the glass windows were finally installed months later. When I returned to Oxley Road, Gurkha policemen, recruited by the British from Nepal, were posted as sentries. To have either Chinese policemen shooting Malays or Malay policemen shooting Chinese would have caused widespread repercussions. The Gurkhas, on the other hand, were neutral besides having a reputation for total discipline and loyalty. All this heightened my sense of insecurity and underlined the urgency of building an army to protect our fragile independence. I had many pressing concerns. First, to get international recognition for Singapore's independence, including our membership in the United Nations, UN. I chose Sinnathamby Rajaratnam, affectionately called Raja by all of us, as foreign minister. He was eminently suitable, with anti-colonial nationalist credentials from his student days in London. Before and during the war, but no rabid radical. Friendly, urbane, sincere, he had the right balance between standing up for principles and the need for diplomatic compromise. He was to be much liked and respected by all those he worked with at home and abroad. As messages of recognition flowed in, To Chin Chai, the Deputy Prime Minister, and Raja as foreign minister set off to New York to take our seat at the UN that September of 1965. My next concern was to defend this piece of real estate. We had no army. Our 2 battalions were under the command of a Malaysian brigadier. How were we to build up some defense forces quickly, however rudimentary? We had to deter and, if need be, prevent any wild move by the Malay ultras, extremists, in Kuala Lumpur, KL, to instigate a coup by the Malaysian forces in Singapore and reverse the independence we had acquired. Many Malay leaders in KL believed that Singapore should never have been allowed to leave Malaysia, but should have been clobbered into submission. If anything were to happen to Tunku Abdul Rahman, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tun Abdul Razak would become the Prime Minister and he could be made to reverse the Tunku's decision by strong-minded ultra leaders. It was a time of great uncertainty. While wrestling with these major concerns, I had to attend to another pressing need keeping law and order. We feared that pro-UMNO Malays would run amok when they realized they had been abandoned by the Malaysian government and were once again a minority. Our policemen were mostly Malays from the kampongs of Malaya, and their loyalty would be strained if they had to take action against Malay rioters who wanted to rejoin Malaysia. Our troops, 2 battalions, were also mostly Malays from Malaya. To my relief, Goh Keng Swee was willing and eager to take on the task of building up the forces. I decided to have him take charge of Home Affairs and Defense, put together into one ministry called MID, Ministry of Interior and Defense. This would allow him to use the police force to help in the basic training of army recruits. To this day, license plates of Singapore Armed Forces vehicles carry the letters MID. Keng Swee's transfer left a void in the finance ministry. I discussed this with him and decided on Lim Kim San as finance minister. Kim San had a practical approach to problems. Moreover, he could work closely with Keng Swee without friction, thus allowing Keng Swee to contribute informally to policies on finance. My third and biggest headache was the economy, how to make a living for our people. Indonesia was confronting us and trade was at a standstill. The Malaysians wanted to bypass Singapore and deal direct with all their trading partners, importers and exporters, and only through their own ports. How was an independent Singapore to survive when it was no longer the center of the wider area that the British once governed as one unit? We needed to find some answers, and soon, for unemployment was alarming at 14% and rising. Furthermore, we had to make a living different from that under British rule. I used to see our godowns, warehouses, filled with rubber sheets, pepper, copra, and rattan, and workers laboriously cleaning and grading them for export. There would be no more imports of such raw materials from Malaysia and Indonesia for processing and grading. We had to create a new kind of economy, try new methods and schemes never tried before anywhere else in the world, because there was no other country like Singapore. Hong Kong was the one island most like us, but it was still governed by the British and it had China as its hinterland. Economically, it was very much a part of China, acting as China's contact with the capitalist world for trade with non-communist countries. After pondering these problems and the limited options available, I concluded an island city-state in Southeast Asia could not be ordinary if it was to survive. We had to make extraordinary efforts to become a tightly knit, rugged, and adaptable people who could do things better and cheaper than our neighbors, because they wanted to bypass us and render obsolete our role as the entrepot and middleman for the trade of the region. We had to be different. Our greatest asset was the trust and confidence of the people. These we had earned by the fight we had put up on their behalf against the communists and the Malay ultras, our refusal to be browbeaten and cowed at a time when the police and the army were both in the hands of the central government. The communists had jeered at my colleagues and me as running dogs of the colonialist imperialists, and cursed us as lackeys and henchmen of the Malay feudalists. But when things got bad, even the skeptical Chinese-speaking left-leaning types saw us, a group of bourgeois English-educated leaders, stand up for them and defend their interests. We were careful not to squander this newly gained trust by misgovernment and corruption. I needed this political strength to maximize what use we could make of our few assets. A natural world-class harbor sited in a strategic location astride one of the busiest sea lanes of the world. The other valuable asset we had was our people, hardworking, thrifty, eager to learn. Although divided into several races, I believed a fair and even-handed policy would get them to live peacefully together, especially if such hardships as unemployment were shared equally and not carried mainly by the minority groups. It was crucial to keep united Singapore's multilingual, multicultural, multi-religious society and make it rugged and dynamic enough to compete in world markets. But how to get into this market? I did not know the answer. Nobody had asked us to push the British out. Driven by our visceral urges, we had done so. Now it was our responsibility to provide for the security and livelihood of the 2 million people under our care. We had to succeed, for if we failed, our only survival option would be a remerger, but on Malaysian terms as a state like Malacca or Penang. I did not sleep well. Chu got my doctors to prescribe tranquilizers, but I found beer or wine with dinner better than the pills. I was then in my early 40s, young and vigorous. However hard and hectic the day had been, I would take 2 hours off in the late afternoon to go on the practice tee to hit 50 to 100 balls and play 9 holes with 1 or 2 friends. Still, I was short of sleep. Late one morning, when the newly arrived British High Commissioner, John Robb, had an urgent message for me from his government, I received him at home lying in bed, physically exhausted. Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, must have been told of this, for he expressed his concern. On August 23, 1965, I replied, "Do not worry about Singapore. My colleagues and I are sane, rational people even in our moments of anguish. We weigh all possible consequences before we make any move on the political chessboard. Our people have the will to fight and the stuff that makes for survival." While brooding over these daunting problems, on the night of September 30, 1965, alarm bells rang with the news of a coup in Indonesia. Pro-communist officers had killed 6 Indonesian generals. A bloodbath followed as General Suharto moved to put down the coup. These further uncertainties deepened my concerns. On that 9th day of August 1965, I had started out with great trepidation on a journey along an unmarked road to an unknown destination.
Chapter 2. Building an Army from Scratch. 2. Building an army from scratch. When Parliament was due to open in December 1965, for months after our separation from Malaysia, Brigadier Syed Mohammed bin Syed Ahmed Alsagoff, who was in charge of a Malaysian brigade stationed in Singapore, called on me and insisted that his motorcycle outriders escort me to Parliament. Alsagoff was a stout, heavy-built Arab Muslim with a moustache, a Singaporean by birth who had joined the Malayan armed forces. To my amazement, he acted as if he was the commander-in-chief of the army in Singapore, ready at any time to take over control of the island. At that time the 1st and 2nd Singapore Infantry Regiments, 1 and 2 Sir, of about 1,000 men each were under Malaysian command. The Malaysian government had placed 700 Malaysians in 1 and 2 Sir, and posted out 300 Singaporean soldiers to various Malaysian units. I weighed the situation and concluded that the Tunku wanted to remind us and the foreign diplomats who would be present that Malaysia was still in charge in Singapore. If I told him off for his presumptuousness, Alsagoff would report this back to his superiors in Kuala Lumpur and they would take other steps to show me who wielded real power in Singapore. I decided it was best to acquiesce. So, for the ceremonial opening of the first Parliament of the Republic of Singapore, Malaysian Army outriders escorted me from my office in City Hall to Parliament House. Not long after this problem, at 4 p.m. on Tuesday the 1st of February, 1966, Keng Swee suddenly came to my office at City Hall with the troubling news that rioting had broken out at an army training depot at Shenton Way, next to the Singapore Polytechnic. When he learned to his astonishment that 80% of recent recruits to all units were Malays, Keng Swee had given instructions that all recruitment and training should cease and the position be frozen. The army commander misinterpreted this and, on his own initiative, had instructed the Chinese major to discharge all Malay recruits. The major assembled everyone in the parade square, asked the non-Malays to fall out, and told the Malays that they were dismissed. For a few minutes, the Malays were dumbfounded at this discrimination. When they recovered from the shock, bedlam broke out as they attacked the non-Malays with poles, sticks, and aerated water bottles, burnt 2 motorcycles, damaged a scooter, and overturned a van. A police patrol car responding to an emergency call drove into a barrage of bottles and could not get past the overturned van. A fire engine that arrived later was similarly attacked. A huge crowd gathered along Shenton Way to watch. Polytechnic students left their classes for a bird's-eye view of the melee from the balconies and rooftop. At about 2:45 p.m., the riot squad arrived in their vans and lobbed tear gas canisters into the crowd. Then specially trained riot police moved in, captured the rioters, bundled them into police vans, and took them across the road to the CID, Criminal Investigation Department, building. They were held at the CID quadrangle pending instructions on whether to charge them and refuse bail, or to let them off on bail. Keng Sui feared that if they were allowed to go, they would start a riot between Malays and Chinese when they got home to Gilang Sarai and other Malay areas and spread the story of how they had been dismissed. I immediately called the British High Commissioner, John Robb, to my office. I asked him to alert the British military commander in case intercommunal riots got out of hand, as the Singapore police and army were still nearly all Malays who would sympathise with the rioters. I told him that I intended to go to the CID building to sort the problem out myself. If it was possible to defuse it, I would let them go home, otherwise, they might have to be charged and held on remand. In that case, some 365 families would miss their sons that night and rumours would spread throughout Singapore of the Malays being oppressed. John Robb said he would report the matter but was careful to point out that British forces could not interfere in an internal security problem. Building an army from scratch 1-3, I said the commander-in-chief or the officer in charge of the British garrison should ensure that British troops were ready to prevent rioters from becoming uncontrollable and turning against the white families as they did in the religious riot involving a Dutch girl in 1950. I tested out my approach on Othman Wak, the Minister for Social Affairs, and had him accompany Keng Sui and me to meet the men at the CID. At the quadrangle, speaking to them in Malay through a handheld battery-powered loudspeaker, I said that the Major had misunderstood his orders, which were to take on only Singapore citizens. He mistakenly thought this meant no Malays were to be recruited, whereas Malays who were Singapore citizens were eligible. 10 of them identified as ringleaders of the riots would be detained and charged by the police, but the rest could go home. They were not to spread rumours when they got home. If any one of those allowed to go home was subsequently identified as a rioter, he would also be charged. I added that all those who were Singapore citizens had to report back to camp the following day for normal training. Only citizens were eligible, and those who were not had to seek employment in Malaysia. The prospect of jobs brought applause and cheers. I had to make a decision on the spot. The least risky option was to hold and punish a few ringleaders but allow the majority to go home. I hoped they would behave themselves because of the prospect of jobs. At a press briefing, I asked the reporters to report the matter tactfully, especially in the Malay paper. When I read the newspapers the next morning, I heaved a sigh of relief. 14 men were charged with rioting, but the Attorney General later decided that it was best to withdraw the charges. This was a sharp reminder to the government that we had to deal with matters of race with the utmost sensitivity. We had another anxious time in November 1967 when Chinese-Malay clashes broke out in Penang and Butterworth, a town on the peninsula opposite Penang Island. The racial situation had deteriorated rapidly in Malaysia after Singapore's separation. Chinese anger and resentment were mounting against their government's Malay language policy. It was sufficiently alarming for us to form a ministerial committee, with Goh Keng Sui as chairman and top officials from the police and the army as members, to prepare contingency plans in case racial riots broke out in Peninsular Malaysia and spilled over to Singapore. Tan Siew Sin, the Malaysian finance minister, had unwisely decided after the British pound was devalued that even for small change there would have to be an adjustment between the old coins issued by the British colonial government, which had been devalued by about 14%, and the new Malaysian coins. This led to sporadic hartals, stoppage of work in protest, which in turn led to racial clashes. Chinese from rural areas were moving into the towns, and we feared that if widespread racial conflicts broke out, the Malaysian armed forces would have difficulty dealing with trouble in many towns. Concern that these riots could involve Singapore forced us to build up our armor quickly. In January 1968, we decided to buy French-made AMX-13 light tanks that the Israelis were selling at discounted prices because they were upgrading their armor. 30 refurbished tanks arrived by June 1969 and another 42 in September 1969. We also bought 174-wheeled V200 armored vehicles. The British had made no offer to help us build an army as they had done with the Malayans in the 1950s. They had worked behind the scenes to get a fair deal for Singapore in Malaysia and incurred the displeasure of the Malaysians. Now they had to deal with a Malaysia more than a little unhappy with them. And because the Malaysians had sponsored us for membership both to the Commonwealth and the United Nations, the British must have guessed that the Malaysians would also want to be our military instructors, if for no other reason than to make sure we were not taught more than they knew about defense. We had to get back our 2 regiments and restore their Singapore identity to ensure their loyalty. Goh Keng Swee, then finance minister, had offered to be defense minister immediately at independence. He was willing to build an army from scratch, although all he knew of military matters was learned as a corporal in the British-led Singapore Volunteer Corps until it surrendered in February 1942. I told him to get going. Keng Swee contacted Mordecai Kidron, the Israeli ambassador in Bangkok, for help. A few days after separation on the 9th of August, Kidron flew in from Bangkok to offer assistance in military training, and Keng Swee. Building an army from scratch 15 brought him to see me. Kidron had approached me several times in 1962 to 1963 to ask for an Israeli consulate in Singapore. He had assured me that Tunku had agreed and that we need not wait until Malaysia was established. I replied that if the Tunku had agreed, there should be no trouble in setting it up after Malaysia was formed, but if I did so before that, I would create an issue that would excite the Malay Muslim grassroots and upset my plans for merger. He was disappointed. As I had expected, when Malaysia came about, the Tunku could not and did not allow an Israeli consulate. I listened to Kidron's proposal on military training but told Keng Swee to put it on hold until Lal Bahadur Shastri, the Prime Minister of India, and President Nasser of Egypt replied to my letters seeking their urgent help to build up our armed forces. I had written to Shastri for a military advisor to help us build up 5 battalions. 2 days later, Shastri replied sending sincere good wishes for the happiness and prosperity of the people of Singapore, but did not mention my request. Nasser, in his reply, extended recognition to Singapore as an independent and sovereign state, but he too did not refer to my request for a naval advisor to build up our coastal defense. I had half expected the Indian government might not want to take sides against Malaysia. India was after all a relatively close neighbor in Asia. But I was disappointed when Nasser, a good friend, opted out. Perhaps it was a case of Muslim solidarity with Malaysia's Muslim leaders. I told Keng Swee to proceed with the Israelis, but to keep it from becoming public knowledge for as long as possible so as not to provoke grassroots antipathy from Malay Muslims in Malaysia and Singapore. A small group of Israelis led by Colonel Jack Elazari arrived in November 1965, followed by a team of 6 in December. To disguise their presence, we called them Mexicans. They looked swarthy enough. We had to have a credible force to protect ourselves. I had no fear of the Tunku changing his mind, but other powerful Malay leaders, like Syed Jafar Albar, who so strongly opposed separation that he had resigned as Secretary-General of UMNO, might persuade Brigadier Alsagoff it was his patriotic duty to reverse separation. The brigadier with his brigade based in Singapore could have captured me and all my ministers without difficulty. So we maintained a quiet, non-challenging posture, while Keng Swee as defense minister worked feverishly to build up some defense capability. We faced another security risk from the racial composition of our army and police. Independent Singapore could not continue the old British practice of having a city three-quarters Chinese policed and guarded by Malay police and soldiers. The British had recruited mostly Malays born in Malaya, who traditionally had come to Singapore to enlist. Malays liked soldiering whereas the Chinese shunned it, a historical legacy of the predatory habits of soldiers during the years of rebellions and warlords in China. The question was whether the army and police would be as loyal to a government no longer British or Malay, but one the Malays perceived as Chinese. We had to find some way to induct more Chinese and Indians into the police and armed forces to reflect the population mix. Shortly after separation, at the request of the Malaysian government, we had sent the 2nd Battalion Sir to Sabah for confrontation duties. We wanted to demonstrate our good faith and solidarity with Malaysia even though a formal defence treaty had not been concluded. This left their barracks, Camp Temasek, vacant. We then agreed to a Malaysian proposal that one Malaysian regiment be sent down to Camp Temasek. The 2nd Battalion Sir was due to return from its duties in Borneo in February 1966, and arrangements were made at staff level for the Malaysian regiment to withdraw. The Malaysian Defence Minister requested that instead of reoccupying Camp Temasek, one Singapore battalion should be sent to the Malayan mainland to enable the Malaysian regiment to remain where it was. Keng Swee did not agree. We wanted both our own battalions in Singapore. We believed the Malaysians had changed their minds because they wanted to keep one battalion of Malaysian forces in Singapore to control us. The Malaysians refused to move out, so the Sir advance party had to live under canvas at Farrer Park. Keng Swee saw me to urgently warn that if our troops were under canvas for too long, with poor facilities for their mess and toilets, there was the risk of a riot or a mutiny. He compared himself to a British general in charge of troops the majority of whom were Italians. The Malaysians could take advantage of Kais and, through Brigadier Alsagoff, mount a coup. He advised me to move from my home on Oxley Road into the Elstana Villa in the Elstana domain and to post Gurkha police guards around just in case. For the next few weeks, my family and I stayed there with a company of Gurkhas on standby. Shortly afterward, the British vacated a camp called Katib in the north of Singapore, near Sembawang. We offered it to the Malaysians and they agreed in mid-March 1966 to move out of our camp to Katib, where they remained for 18 months before withdrawing of their own accord in November 1967. Their unreasonableness only made us more determined to build up the Singapore Armed Forces, SAF, so that they could not intimidate us in this way. It stiffened our resolve and made us dig our heels in. Keng Swee, ever the intrepid fighter, had written in his paper to DeFeo, Defense Council, "It is foolish to allow ourselves to be hypnotized by the disparity in the population ratios between Singapore and her neighbors. What counts is the fighting strength of the armed forces, not the size of populations. After 5 years of conscription we can field an army of 150,000 by mobilizing those on the reserve service. By using older persons and women for non-combatant duties we should eventually be able to field an army with a combat strength of 250,000 consisting of men between the ages of 18 and 35. The war-making potential of a small, vigorous, well-educated and highly motivated population should never be underestimated." This was an ambitious plan based on the Israeli practice of mobilizing the maximum number possible in the shortest time possible. We thought it important for people in and outside Singapore to know that despite our small population, we could mobilize a large fighting force at short notice. Ours was no easy task. We had to reorientate people's minds to accept the need for a people's army and overcome their traditional dislike for soldiering. Every Chinese parent knew the saying "How han bu dang bing, how tai bu da ding," a good lad does not become a soldier, good steel does not become nails. We set up National Cadet Corps and National Police Cadet 1-8 from 3rd World to 1st Corps in all secondary schools so that parents would identify the army and police with their sons and daughters. We wanted the people to regard our soldiers as their protectors, a reversal from the days when army and police uniforms aroused fear and resentment as symbols of colonial coercion. People must admire military valor. As Kung Sui said in Sorrow, the Spartan approach to life does not come about naturally in a community that lives by buying and selling. I had to get people to change their attitudes. We also had to improve the physical condition of our young by getting them to participate in sports and physical activity of all kinds, and to develop a taste for adventure and strenuous, thrilling activities that were not without danger to themselves. Persuasion alone was not enough. We needed institutions, well organized, well staffed, and well directed to follow up the exhortations and stirring speeches. The prime responsibility was that of the Ministry of Education. Only if we changed people's thinking and attitudes could we raise a large citizen army like Switzerland's or Israel's. We gave ourselves a decade to accomplish this. On the first anniversary of independence, we mustered what little we had to boost our people's morale. We had organized the People's Defense Force, PDF, under the leadership of a motley collection of civil servants, members of parliament, MPs, and ministers who had been put through a crash officer training course. The soldiers were civilians, mostly Chinese educated, recruited through the community centers. Several PDF platoons marched on our first National Day celebrations, the 9th of August, 1966. They put up a brave show and were cheered enthusiastically by those behind the saluting dais and by the crowds lining the streets as they recognized their suntanned ministers and MPs in uniform, eager in their stride if lacking in martial bearing. Our community leaders representing all races took part in the parade bearing banners or slogans. Chinese, Indian, Malay, and British business leaders joined in the contingent that marched past the president in front of City Hall. They were lustily cheered. There were units from the trade unions, the PAP, and the statutory boards. The police and fire brigade were brought in to add to the uniforms on display. The Malaysians might not have been in awe of our military capability, but they could not but be impressed by the determination and the spirit with which we were building up our defense forces to protect our fledgling state. Kung Sui's original plan was to build up a regular army of 12 battalions between 1966 and 1969. Disagreeing with this plan, I proposed a small standing army plus the capacity to mobilize the whole civilian population who should be trained and put into reserves. Kung Sui argued that we had first to train a good number of regular officers and non-commissioned officers in his 12 battalions before we could train civilians on such a large scale. I did not want money spent on the recurrent costs of a large army. It was better spent on the infrastructure we needed to raise and train national service battalions. National service would bring political and social benefits. Kung Sui took the professional military view that an immediate threat from Malaysia had to be countered by a solid regular fighting force raised in the next 3 years. I said the Malaysians were unlikely to attack us while British and Commonwealth forces were in Singapore. Their presence would be a deterrent even without a defense treaty. I wanted the defense plan to aim at mobilizing as large a part of the population as possible, in order to galvanize the people in their own defense while they had this strong feeling of patriotism as a result of their recent experiences. A revised plan Kung Sui put up in November 1966 would mobilize a large section of the population and keep the regular component of the armed forces at 12 battalions. I was keen to have our women do national service as Israeli women did, because that would reinforce the people's will to defend themselves. But Kung Sui did not want his new ministry to carry this extra burden. As the other ministers in DeFeo were also not anxious to draft our women, I did not press my point. The best deterrent to any Malaysian plan to regain control over Singapore was their knowledge that even if they could subdue our armed forces, they would have to keep down a whole people well trained in the use of arms and explosives. Besides integrating the people into a more united community through equal treatment of recruits regardless of their social background or race, we needed to attract and retain some of the best talents in the highest echelons of the SAF. Most important of all, we had to ensure that the SAF remained subordinate to the political leadership by keeping important functions such as manpower and finance under civilian officers in the Defense Ministry. DeFeo endorsed all these objectives. In February 1967, I tabled legislation to amend the National Service Ordinance which had been passed by the British in 1952. Those who enlisted in the SAF as a full-time career would be guaranteed jobs in the government, statutory boards, or the private sector when they left full-time service to go into the reserves. There was full public support when the bill was passed a month later. I recalled the first call-up in 1954 under this same ordinance and the riots by Chinese middle school students. This time we had no problems getting 9,000 young men registered in the first batch. I was right about the changed public attitude. Meanwhile, Kung Sui assembled a team and, with Israeli help, started the build-up. He made use of police personnel, communications equipment, and other assets to kickstart the process. The Assistant Commissioner for Police, Tan Tek Kim, became Director General Staff. We began training a select group in August 1967, the top 10% of the batch registered. To counter the traditional prejudice against soldiery, we held send-off ceremonies for the recruits from community centres in every constituency. MPs, ministers, and community leaders would attend and make short speeches before the recruits mounted the military trucks that took them to basic training camps. Over the years, we gradually broke down the resistance to soldiering. It was a crash program with everybody on crash courses. There was much confusion. Arrangements were never 100% prepared and crisis management was the order of the day, but it was an urgent and crucial task that had to be accomplished in the shortest possible time. We had to achieve it with men of little experience and unexceptional ability. But the esprit de corps was excellent and they made progress. While we made haste in the build-up, we had another uneasy period in October 1968, after 2 Indonesian commandos were hanged for killing 3 Singapore citizens when they exploded a bomb at the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in Orchard Road in 1964. When their appeals were dismissed by the Privy Council in London, Indonesian President Suharto sent his close aide, a brigadier general, to petition our president for clemency and to commute the death sentence to imprisonment. Building an army from scratch too. The cabinet had met earlier to decide what advice to give the president. We had already released 43 Indonesians detained for offences committed during confrontation. In response to Indonesian pleas, we had also released 2 Indonesians convicted and sentenced to death for carrying a time bomb in Singapore. But these persons had been arrested before they could do harm, unlike the other case, where 3 civilians had been killed. We were small and weak. If we yielded, then the rule of law not only within Singapore but between our neighbours and Singapore would become meaningless, as we would always be open to pressure. If we were afraid to enforce the law while British forces were still in Singapore, even though they had announced that they would be withdrawing by 1971, then our neighbours, whether Indonesia or Malaysia, could walk over us with impunity after 1971. So we decided not to abort the due process of law by acceding to the petition. The 2 men were hanged on the 17th of October. I was in Tokyo then on an official visit. Some 20 to 30 Indonesians gathered near the Gaihinkan, the Japanese government guest house, carrying placards and banners in protest when I drove by. In Jakarta, an Indonesian crowd rampaged through the Singapore embassy, shattering pictures of the President of Singapore and generally wreaking havoc, but did not burn the embassy as they had done to the British. Our ambassador, P.S. Raman, formerly the director of Radio and Television Singapore, was a stout-hearted Tamil Brahmin and a Christian convert. He and his staff held themselves up with the same aplomb and defiance as Andrew Gilchrist, the British ambassador, had done when Indonesians rampaged through the British embassy in 1963. But unlike Gilchrist, the Singapore embassy staff did not have a bagpiper to add panache to a display of sang-froid. The next day, ABRI, the Indonesian Armed Forces, announced that they would hold maneuvers in their territorial waters off the Rio Islands close to Singapore. The Indonesian Marine commander said that he would personally lead a task force to invade Singapore. 1,000 student demonstrators called on the commander of the Indonesian East Java forces to take revenge against Singapore. The press reported that the Indonesian army believed Communist China had pressured Singapore to hang the two men. A week later, the Indonesian government announced a curtailment of trade with Singapore, imposing restrictions on exports. Our intelligence assessed that while there would be no open aggression, sabotage was probable. In any event, none took place. It was a more serious crisis when a tense racial situation enveloped Singapore following bloody race riots in Kuala Lumpur on the 13th of May, 1969, a few days after their general election. It spread alarm among both Chinese and Malays in Singapore. Everyone feared that the racial clashes would spill into Singapore, and they did. Malaysian Chinese who had fled to Singapore recounted stories of brutalities inflicted on their relatives there. As news spread of Malay atrocities and the bias of the Malaysian armed forces in dealing with the situation, anger and alarm rose in Singapore. Taking advantage of their greater numbers in Singapore, the Chinese took revenge for what had happened in Kuala Lumpur. On the 19th of May, 20 to 30 Chinese youths assaulted several Malays in a Malay area near Sultan Mosque at Sultan Gate. When I returned to Singapore from America on the 20th of May, I was told that a Malay had been shot and killed by a group of Chugs not very far from Raffles Institution. The clashes went on intermittently for several weeks. On the 1st of June, I visited the Malay settlement at Geylang Serai, the site of serious race clashes. Lim Kim San as Minister of Defence accompanied me in a Land Rover driven by a Malay policeman, with the police superintendent for the area sitting beside the driver. Bok Kim San and I immediately noticed the sullen, unfriendly looks of our Malay soldiers deployed on the ground. Even the police superintendent, a Malay officer I had known personally for several years, looked sour. I felt strongly that something was amiss. I sensed that the Malays were terrified. The situation was different from the 1964 race riots when the police and army, largely Malays, were controlled by Malay leaders in Kuala Lumpur and had been especially protective of the Malays and punitive cowed the Chinese. This time the Malays in Singapore were fearful. Although the police were still largely Malay, Singapore's Chinese leaders who were now in charge of the government might be against chemical and direct the police and army accordingly. I was determined to make it clear to all, in particular the Chinese, now the majority, that the government would enforce the law impartially regardless of race or religion. Because of strong police action, 684 Chinese and 349 Malays were arrested, but there was not enough evidence to proceed against all. Only 36 persons were charged in court, 18 Chinese and 18 Malays. The most serious charge was against a Chinese for attempted murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. 1 Chinese and 3 Malays had been killed, 11 Chinese and 49 Malays injured. We were shocked to find how race relations in Singapore had become so polarized. Even Malays who had served in our police and armed forces for many years had become very race conscious, easily swayed by racial pulls during the race riots in Malaysia. I wanted to be sure that the police and army were not weakened by communal pulls. I also wanted an explanation why so many Malay soldiers were deployed in Geylang Serai, where a Chinese minority would have been more reassured by a mixed-race force. I decided we had to review the racial mix of new recruits in the SAE. Kim San looked into this and found that in spite of the 1966 incident at the Shenton Way Army Training Depot, we had over-recruited Malays into the SAE. George Bogars, then Permanent Secretary of the Defense Ministry and one of our most trusted officers, had been Director of Special Branch, where he learned to distrust the Chinese educated because nearly all communists were Chinese educated. He preferred Malays when recruiting non-commissioned officers and warrant officers for the SAF to train our national servicemen, believing the Chinese educated were prone to Chinese chauvinism and communism. This bias had to be redressed, a sensitive task that we entrusted to a team headed by Bogars. A young Lieutenant Colonel, Edward Yong, implemented a plan that over several years reduced the proportion of Malays, mainly by recruiting more non-Malays. I had invited the five-power Commonwealth defence ministers, Malaysia, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, to attend our celebrations for the 150th anniversary of the founding of Singapore. Rozak, representing Malaysia, attended our National Day parade on the 9th of August, 1969. Kim San arranged for a squadron of AMX-13 tanks and V-200 armoured vehicles to roll past in the parade. It had a dramatic effect on the people in Johor when they saw it on television that night, and elsewhere in Malaysia the following day in their newspapers, which carried photos of the tanks. The Malaysians had no tanks then. At my dinner that night, Rozak told Keng Swee that many people in Malaysia were concerned over our armour, but he himself was not. He said there was anxiety in Johor whether Singapore intended to invade the state and suggested that Kim San as defence minister should go to Kuala Lumpur to convince people that Singapore's intentions toward Malaysia were not hostile. Keng Swee's note to DeFeo concluded, "One bright spot in this whole melancholy episode, the race riots in Kuala Lumpur, is the salutary effect our armour has had on the Malay political base. It was as well that we had decided to buy tanks and armoured vehicles." The 3rd of May 1969 race riots in Kuala Lumpur polarised race relations in Malaysia, resurrecting my fear that with Tun Abdul Razak now in charge and the Malay ultras on the ascendant, the Tunku could be shunted aside, and the ultra leaders could decide to send the army marching down to take Singapore back into the Federation forcibly. I asked Yong Pung Hao, my friend from Cambridge days then living in Kuala Lumpur, later Chief Justice of Singapore, when he visited Singapore, what the Malaysian public's perception of the SAF was. He said that in 1966, people thought it was all a joke. But this was no longer the case. Word had passed round the cocktail circuit in Kuala Lumpur that the Singapore Armed Forces Training Institute, SAFT, trained good soldiers, and British High Commission officials had confirmed this. By 1971, we had 17 National Service battalions, 16,000 men, with 14 battalions, 11,000 men, in the reserves. We had infantry and commando units, artillery units with mortars, a battalion each of tanks, armoured personnel carriers, field engineers, signals, field maintenance, field hospital, and field supply, and a heavy transport company. We had established schools for basic military training and officer cadets, the artillery, engineers, bomb disposal units, and naval training. Our Air Force had a squadron each of Hunters, Strike Master trainer aircraft, Alouette helicopters, and transport aircraft. Until we could achieve a credible defence capability in the 1970s, we had to rely on the British military presence. We had hoped they would stay on for 5 to 10 years, to provide a shield behind which we could build up our own forces. But the British announced their withdrawal in January 1968. This forced us to try to build up one fighter squadron and a small navy capable of coastal defence against infiltrators before they left in 1971. These modest objectives drew down considerable resources from our strapped economy with limited trained manpower. We sent our first batch of 6 trainee pilots to Britain for training in August 1968, 7 months after the withdrawal announcement. By September 1970, we had one squadron of 16 fighter planes, Hawker Hunters, operational in Singapore. The Israelis helped us plan our naval build-up, and the New Zealanders trained our sailors for our fast patrol boats. 2 squadrons of 3 boats each were operational in less than 2 years. Then we progressed to missile gunboats. While the Israelis were competent, not only in transmitting military skills but also in imparting the doctrines upon which they based their training, their methods were the exact opposite of the British, who had built 1 and 2 SIR in a gradual step-by-step approach, training the officer corps from platoon commanders to company commanders and finally, after 15 or 20 years, to battalion commanders and lieutenant colonels. The Israelis insisted from the very start that our officers learn from them and take over as instructors as soon as possible. Unlike the Americans who, under President Kennedy, sent about 3,000 to 6,000 men in the first batch of advisors to help Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem build up the South Vietnamese army. The Israelis sent us only 18 officers. Every job they did was understudied by a Singaporean counterpart, from platoon commanders to company commander, up to Director General Staff. We too opted police officers and former Singapore Volunteer Corps officers from British days, those with some military or paramilitary experience. Some were government servants, others were from the private sector. We offered them full-time appointments. The British Army placed great store on spit and polish and square bashing to inculcate discipline and obedience to orders from superiors. The Israelis emphasized military skills and high motivation. Smartness on parade and military tattoo, the SAF never learned from the Mexicans. Whatever smartness the SAF had came from British officers in charge of 1 and 2 Sir in their early years. Once the Israeli officers led by Elazari had started work and he had us hooked, Kidron demanded a quid pro quo that Singapore recognize Israel officially and exchange ambassadors. He was persistent in pressing for this. I told Kung Sui that this was a non-starter. We would anger the Malay Muslims in Singapore and Malaysia whose sympathies were with their Muslim brothers, the Palestinians, and the Arabs. We could not agree to do this even if the Israelis decided to withdraw. When they knew that it was a non-starter, Tel Aviv sent a message that they understood our position and they would be helpful, but that they hoped we would eventually allow them an embassy in Singapore. When the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War broke out in June 1967, we were relieved the Israelis were not defeated or our SAF would have lost confidence in their Israeli instructors. When the UN General Assembly was debating the resolution to condemn Israel, Roger Rotnam, our foreign minister and an Afro-Asian champion, was all for it. Kung Sui saw me to press Raja to direct our UN delegate not to vote in favor of the resolution or the Israelis would leave. As I could not attend the cabinet meeting, I stated my position in a note. We had to stand up for the right of small nations to exist. Freedom of navigation of all international highways, such as the Straits of One Iran and the Straits of Malacca, were vital and the UN should play a role in preserving peace or resolving the problem after hostilities. I added that I did not believe the Israeli advisors would leave even if we were to vote for the Afro-Asian resolution. I was in favor of abstaining in the vote. The cabinet agreed with my view. We abstained and the Israelis did not leave. However, now that the Israeli presence in Singapore was well known, we allowed them a diplomatic mission. They wanted an embassy. We decided to allow them a trade representative office first, in October 1968. The following May, after Malay Muslims in Singapore and the region had become accustomed to an Israeli presence, we allowed them to upgrade it to an embassy. Our reservists had to be ever ready for combat. We changed their title in 1994 from reservists to operationally ready NS men to emphasize their combat readiness. For a few weeks each year, they do in-camp training in their same units to build up camaraderie. Once every few years, they are sent to Taiwan, Thailand, Brunei, or Australia for brigade-level field exercises or battalion-level live firing exercises. Annual in-camp training is taken seriously by everyone, including employers who have to lose the services of their executives and men for a few weeks each year. To be effective, the SAF has to mobilize and involve the whole society in defense activities. So, school principals, teachers, parents, employers, and community leaders are brought into a supporting network under a concept called total defense. This keeps morale high. National service has had a profound impact on Singapore society over the last 30 years. It has become a rite of passage for our young men and a part of our way of life that has helped to unify our people. They learn to live and work closely with each other, regardless of race, language, or religion. Food taboos of Muslims and Hindus are respected, as are all religious rites, from Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh to Christian and Zoroastrian. Whether your father is a minister, banker, professional, laborer, taxi driver, or hawker, your military standing depends on your performance. To have both brains and brawn, Kang Sui and I started to induct some of our ablest students into the SAF in 1971. We selected some of the best officer cadets each year for SAF overseas scholarships to study at Oxbridge and other universities in Britain, where they did a full academic course in the humanities, sciences, engineering, or the professions. During their student years they received full pay as lieutenants, besides a scholarship that paid for all fees, board and lodging, and other needs abroad. They had to sign a bond to serve for 8 years after graduation. But within that period, they would be sent to America or Britain on 2, often 3 courses: first, specialist training whether in artillery, armor, or signals, in midcareer, staff and command in America or Britain, and finally a course in public or business administration at a top American university such as Harvard or Stanford. At the end of 8 years, they could opt to stay in the SAF, transfer to the public service as administrative officers, the top grade of civil servants, join a statutory board, or leave for the private sector. They would do their annual national service training of 2 to 3 weeks. Through this scheme, which I proposed and Kang Sui refined, we recruited some of our best students into the SAF. Without a yearly intake of about 10 of our best students, the SAF would have the military hardware but without the brainpower to use them to best advantage. The quality of the early batches was reassuring. By 1995, for former SAF scholars, having risen to senior positions, entered politics and later became cabinet ministers, my son, Brigadier General Li Xianlong, Brigadier General George Yew, Lieutenant Colonel Lim Hng Kiang, and Rear Admiral Teo Chi Heen. Singapore's limited size was a severe constraint. As our build-up expanded, we needed training areas overseas to deploy a brigade, and later a division. I made a breakthrough in 1975 when President Chiang Ching-kwee allowed our infantry, armor, and artillery to train in Taiwan. We also held combined arms exercises in Taiwan with Siegfried Schultz, a retired general of the Federal Republic of Germany, who accompanied our senior officers on staff rides to teach them the finer points of field maneuvers. President Marcos and the U.S. Defense Department allowed the Republic of Singapore Air Force to use U.S. training facilities at Clark Air Base in the late 1970s. When the Americans left Clark in the 1990s, we moved our training to Australia and America. We had to find unconventional solutions to our problems. A country's defense capability has to be continually upgraded as new technology, especially information technology, is incorporated into weapon systems. This requires a sound economy that can afford to pay for new weaponry and a highly educated and trained people who can integrate the various arms into one system and operate them efficiently and effectively. A credible defense capability helps to lower the risk of rash political acts. Whenever they were displeased with us, Malaysian leaders regularly uttered threats in the press to cut off our water supply. In 1990, when I stepped down as Prime Minister, Military Technology, an international defense journal, wrote, in 1965, when Singapore became an independent nation, it had virtually nothing in the way of armed forces to defend itself. By 1990, the Singapore Armed Forces, SAF, had grown into a respected and professional force operating modern defense systems that was capable of defending the territorial integrity and independence of the state. Since then, the SAF's capability and readiness have continued to be rated highly by defense journals including Jane's and Asia Pacific Defense Reporter. Such an outcome was far from my thoughts in April 1966 when I flew to London hoping for assurance from Prime Minister Harold Wilson that British forces would remain in Singapore for some years.
Chapter 3. Britain Pulls Out. 3. Britain pulls out. Dennis Healy laughed when Kang Sui and I asked him in October 1966 to sell us a squadron of Hawker Hunter fighter aircraft. He wagged his finger at us and asked what we were up to. British forces would look after us. We left London reassured that the Royal Air Force, RAF, would stay in Singapore. We badly needed the confidence British forces generated. If they were to leave suddenly before we had any capacity to defend ourselves, I did not think we could survive. Their presence gave people a sense of security, without which we would not get investments and be able to export our goods and services. That was the only way we could create enough jobs to absorb our school leavers and prevent massive unemployment. In January that year, I had met Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, at an emergency Commonwealth Prime Ministers' Conference in Lagos on Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence. In between meetings, we discussed the future of British forces in Singapore. He told me that he might have to take away 25,000 of the 50,000 troops guarding Malaysia. Although he said no decision had yet been made, my impression was that he was moving toward troop reduction. To get a better understanding of British intentions, I visited London in April 1966 to discuss their defense planning. It was disturbing to discover a growing lobby for withdrawal from east of Suez, both in the Labour and Conservative parties and among their top leader writers and commentators. Healey, corroborated by the British press, said that there were strong advocates in the cabinet for a quick phased withdrawal, with George Brown, number 2 to Wilson, leading the group. Paul Johnson, the New Statesman editor, went so far as to name the year 1968. This point of view would easily win support from the Labour Party and Labour MPs. Ian MacLeod, a former Conservative minister and now the Shadow Minister for Finance and Economic Affairs, told me that there were many Europeans, those favoring integration with Europe, in his party who were keen on withdrawal. Wilson, I felt, was committed, at least over this term of office, to carry on with Singapore and Malaysia, and there must have been a quid pro quo from the Americans for Britain to stay. Friendly ambassadors told me that the Americans were helping the British to support the value of the pound sterling, on condition that the British continued to maintain their presence east of Suez. The Americans had good reasons to want the British to stay. By January 1966, their forces in South Vietnam had reached 150,000, and the U.S. Air Force was bombing selected targets in North Vietnam. Later, George Brown confirmed to me that the quid was U.S. support for the British pound sterling, then overvalued and under pressure. Dennis Healey, the defense secretary, was the most important leader I had to meet after Wilson. I liked him personally. He had a powerful intellect, like a computer which kept on putting out new solutions as more data was fed in, ready to abandon fundamental positions taken earlier. His supple mind and facility with words made him a congenial dinner companion, full of interesting and useful gossip about people I wanted to know more about. But he could be biting in his assessments. He once said of a Commonwealth Prime Minister, pointing to both sides of his forehead, "He is wood from here to here." From him I had a good rundown of the position of the Labour ministers. He believed it was possible but difficult for the British government to maintain its military presence in the Far East into the 1970s. In the cabinet, most ministers favored a phased withdrawal within the next 5 years. Only Harold Wilson, Michael Stewart, and Healey himself, a formidable combination, were keen on keeping British forces east of Suez in the next decade. I was reassured, for I had met Michael Stewart, the Foreign Secretary, and found him a steady, dependable man. Healey said there was a strong body of opinion in the Labour Party that wanted complete withdrawal of British forces from their overseas commitments, believing these forces in the Far East to be less an instrument for the maintenance of peace and security, and more a catspaw in the squabbles of regional governments. He warned that Britain's military policy on the Far East might well change in the life of the present government. This uncertainty over the duration of their military presence was a constant worry. Kung Sui and I agreed that whatever the British finally decided, we had to build up a visible defense capability as soon as possible, to make it apparent to our people and our neighbors that we were not defenseless. The day before my departure, on Monday, April 25th, I had a final meeting with Harold Wilson. He asked about the contribution of British bases to the economy of Singapore. I assessed it at about 20% of the gross domestic product, GDP. A rundown of the bases would result in the repatriation of appreciable numbers of Malaysians and Indians. This would be a dislocation of the economy, but I feared most the effect on the morale of our people. It had taken immense effort to get them off the fence, and to convince them that communism was not the inexorable wave of the future. The withdrawal of British troops and the closure of the bases would lead to a serious erosion of morale. People could be resigned to the inevitability of China's might. I concluded that Wilson and his government could not do much to help Singapore settle its defense and economic treaty with Malaysia. Their influence had declined, especially with the easing of confrontation by Indonesia. The visit was as satisfactory as I could have hoped. All the British leaders, particularly Wilson and Healey, stressed that they were badly shaken by the separation, that we should not have taken so drastic a step without consulting them, and at a time when they were defending us against Indonesia's confrontation. There was a great deal of heart-searching then as to whether they should stay on in Southeast Asia. They underlined it to emphasize the gravity of the situation. For the immediate future, I was reassured that Singapore had friends in the Labour government and in the opposition Conservative Party leadership. It would give us a few years' time, I hoped, to get some defense forces built up, revive our economy, resume trade with Indonesia, and, most important of all, get investments in industry. Wilson showed friendliness in every way during the week I spent in London that April. He had given me lunch at 10 Downing Street with key cabinet ministers and opposition House of Lords leader, Peter Carrington, and their wives present. In an impromptu speech, he spoke in the warmest terms. In reply, I thanked him for his friendship and support. Soon after I left London, Wilson came under pressure from his Labour Party to cut back on overseas defence commitments. At a parliamentary Labour Party meeting in June 1966, he had to appeal to their socialist sentiments. Frankly, if we had only ourselves to think of, we would be glad to leave Singapore as quickly as possible. We cannot, however, say, as we do in Aden, that we are not wanted by the local government and local population. Kuan Yew, as good a left-wing and democratic socialist as any in this room, certainly wants us to stay there. Let us remember in the political battles of Southeast Asia and in his own electoral struggles, he has shown tremendous courage in fighting communism in an area the communists would dearly like to control. The government of Singapore, as we understand it, is the only democratic socialist government, as we understand the phrase, in Southeast Asia. His social record, in his housing program for example, defies challenge in anything that has been done in the most advanced social democratic communities. After London, I attended a Socialist International Conference in Stockholm to keep in touch with British and European Socialist Party leaders. There I met George Brown over lunch. He spoke in frank and blunt terms. He wanted to pull out from Southeast Asia, the sooner the better. He admitted that he was in a minority, but he intended to persist. Brown said Wilson and Healey had a warm regard for me and the Singapore government, but he was fed up that this was made an excuse for British policy east of Suez. He had wanted to include a firm declaration to pull out in a defense review published in October 1965, but had been outvoted. I argued that if Britain had pulled out, the Americans would not have backed sterling. Then the pound would have been devalued and Labour would have lost the second election. He muttered resentfully that the Lyndon-Johnson-Harold-Wilson agreement would do Britain no good in the long run. In July 1966, Healey visited Singapore and told me that troop levels in Singapore and Malaysia would be cut to the position they would have been if there were no confrontation. He had been to Kuala Lumpur. With a straight face, he said he had told the press that there was no anti-British feeling there, and no reason ochre than Britain's economic difficulties had prevented aid to Malaysia. He winked and said the Malaysians had learned that what he called their Hate Britain Month had caused a bad impression and was counterproductive. The Malaysian leaders had reacted angrily to criticism in the British media of their race and language policies, and they had gone sour over the British. By the time he arrived, it was Love Britain Month. He was jovial, full of bonhomie, and reassuring. There were times when I felt that the British would be able to stay for a decade into the 1970s. At ochre moments, I feared that time was fast running out on Wilson and Healey. The mood among British Labour MPs was strongly in favour of cutting defence spending overseas to concentrate resources on Britain itself. Healey made a second visit to Singapore on April 22, 1967. He made clear that Britain would be out of mainland Asia by the late 1970s. I urged that confidence in the general security of the area be maintained and that there should be no sudden changes. Healy explained that the decision to pull out had been made for economic, not military, reasons and was therefore unlikely to be changed. There was no ochre way of resolving Britain's financial problem. There was also fear of Britain becoming involved in a Vietnam War. The British were aghast at the bloodletting in Vietnam. Another meeting 2 days later, he tried to soften the blow by talking of significant aid to Singapore. After all, he was talking about cuts, not total withdrawal. He realized the significance of the confidence factor and would cry to persuade his colleagues on Kais. But he had to make long-term plans for British defense, and it was not possible to do that bit by bit. He asked about our plans for the naval dockyard. I told him of our intention to have Swan and Hunter, a British firm of shipbuilders, take over and civilianize it, and that I had already persuaded them to take over our civilian Keppel dockyard, to familiarize themselves with our conditions. Both Harold Holt, the Prime Minister of Australia, and Keith Holyoake, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, cabled to warn me that heavy reductions in British forces were under consideration, and that this would lead to disengagement and dismantlement of the existing framework of Commonwealth defence arrangements. Among the British military commanders in Singapore, there was no expectation of a precipitate withdrawal. In May, a month after Healy's visit, Kung Sui and I had a working dinner with Sir Michael Carver, British Commander-in-Chief Far East. Carver was most reassuring. He said the principal role of Singapore's defense forces should be the prevention of a coup from within or from the outside. In the event of sustained hostilities, we would have to depend on allies. His attitude you'd me that he expected British forces to stay in Singapore for some time. In case Carver's political masters were thinking otherwise or were under pressure to do the unthinkable, I wrote to Harold Wilson on May 26 that any talk about significant aid had ominous implications. The danger of economic dislocation was secondary compared to the grave danger of damaged confidence when it became known that the British had decided to move out by the mid-1970s. Wilson sent a comforting reply and then invited me to London for preliminary talks. When Kung Sui and I met Healy in June 1967, he gave a detailed list of the force reductions up to 3 March 1, 1968, and the rundown from 1968 to 1971. After 1971, Britain would have an amphibious force in Southeast Asia, a sort of policeman on the beat. Discussions on the economic implications were handled by Kung Sui. Like me, he was more worried over the security than the economic implications of a rundown of British forces. We both felt that we could somehow manage the economic rundown if we had security and confidence was not shaken. I asked an official from the Ministry of Overseas Development who had dealt with problems related to the rundown of British forces in Malta whether abandoned airfields could be put to civilian use. In British experience, he said, abandoned airfields were either reverted to agriculture or, in a few instances, made available for light industry. I did not think agriculture or light industry at all promising for Singapore and asked that our Economic Development Board be given early access to the 3 British airfields, Tenga, Sealtar and Changi, to decide how we could use them later. British military regulations required them to destroy surplus military equipment, but Healy agreed to revise the regulations so that such equipment could be handed over to Singapore for training and other uses. He and his team bent over backward to help. These 2 meetings were a great relief. We felt confident we could sort out our problems by the middle 1970s. I could not have asked for more. Swan and Hunter had confirmed that the prospects for the naval dockyard at Sembawang were very good, and a committee comprising the Navy Department, Swan and Hunter, and the Singapore government could plan its conversion to commercial use. In a private discussion on June 26, 1967, Wilson promised that this would be the last defense review for the present Parliament. Healy separately also promised that there would be no further defense reviews. My impression was that Wilson, even more than Healy, wanted to keep open Britain's options east of Suez. What he wanted of me in London was not so much to argue the merits of staying east of Suez, but to work on Labour backbenchers and those cabinet ministers who were against staying. I spoke to Labour backbenchers at the House of Commons later that afternoon. The Afro-Asian scene had changed rapidly, I said. Nehru was dead, Sukarno was discredited, and Mao was involved in the madness of the Cultural Revolution. 500,000 American troops were in South Vietnam. The days of the white man's control of Asia had passed. Instead, some Asians insisted upon Asian solutions to Asian problems so that the big Asian countries could settle their problems with the smaller ones. The smaller ones had the right to ask their friends from the West to help redress the balance. I spent hours talking to Wilson's ministers. A scheduled half-hour meeting with Jim Callaghan, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, whom I had met several times over the previous 15 years, went on to 1.5 hours. From time to time, whenever the division bells rang, he went out to the lobby to vote but asked me to stay. At the end, he said, "I was for naming a date by which Britain should be off, but I will think over what you have told me. At the moment, I have an open mind." He asked me to see Roy Jenkins, then Home Secretary. Roy Jenkins listened to me quietly and said that he would support naming no dates, but that Britain must be off the mainland by 1975. The minister most opposed to our position was Dick Crossman, then leader of the House. For 1 hour, he hectored and berated me for misleading and beguiling his colleagues into staying east of Suez. He set out to shock me by being deliberately rude. He wanted Britain to get out quickly, by 1970. He and his group of MPs wanted savings for more old age pensions, cheaper interest for home loans, and more votes. In his frustration, he said, "You don't have to worry about me, for I am a minority voice in the cabinet for the time being, but I am winning, and more the party is coming around to my point of view." Our High Commissioner, A.P. Raja, who was present, thought Crossman was letting off steam because my arguments had strengthened the hand of those who wanted to stay. I believed we were all right this time, but there was no guarantee there would be no further knocks on the pound, which would lead to another fit of depression in the British cabinet, another defense review, and further watering down of their forces. This danger was one beyond the control even of the British government. The sad fact was the malaise of the British people, and the leadership was not inspiring their people. Both Labour ministers and backbenchers were despondent that they had had to do all the things they had said they did not want to do, including the stop-go economic policy for which they had criticized the Conservative government. President Lyndon Johnson's papers showed that he had urged Wilson in Washington in June 1967 not to take any steps which would be contrary to British or American interest and to the interest of the free nations of Asia. But Johnson did not push as hard as his aides had urged in their submissions to him before the meeting. Robert McNamara, Johnson's defense secretary, had written to Johnson as early as December 1965 that America placed a higher value on British presence and commitment in the Far East than in Europe. The British Defense White Paper published in July 1967 announced their intention to reduce forces in Southeast Asia by 50% by 1970 to 1971 and to withdraw completely by the mid-1970s. A dismayed Harold Holt wrote to Wilson and made his views known to me. "We see the UK government as having taken historic decisions to reduce its world role and contract, to a significant degree, from any kind of international responsibility that Britain has carried for many, many years, and that the Australians must now rethink our whole situation." Soon afterward, Wilson invited me to speak at his Labour Party annual conference in October 1967. I agreed, knowing he wanted me to talk his party into not opposing his staying on in Singapore. I was their main guest speaker, a fraternal delegate at their eve of conference rally on Sunday, October 1st, at Scarborough. I expressed the hope that Singapore's long association with the British over a period of 150 years could allow them to make the disengagement in a way to give us the best chance of continuing security and stability, and that given a little time and no little effort, we would live as well in the mid-1970s without British base expenditure as we were doing then. I knew the delegates would be preoccupied with Vietnam. Since I could not ignore the subject, I said, I do not want to sound like a hawk or a dove. If I have to choose a metaphor from the aviary, I would like to think of the owl. Anyone looking at what is happening in Vietnam must have baleful eyes. It need never have been thus. And perhaps it was not the wisest place, nor the safest ground in Asia to have made a stand. But enormous sacrifices have already been expended, and in blood, both Vietnamese and American. For that anti-Vietnam audience, this was the furthest I could go to hint that if the Americans pulled out, there would be severe repercussions for the rest of Southeast Asia. Barely 6 weeks later, without any warning, on Sunday, November 18, 1967, Kung Sui received a message from Callahan, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, similar to one he must have sent to all Commonwealth finance ministers, that the British were devaluing the pound sterling from $2.80 to $2.40. That meant we had lost 14.3% of the reserves we kept in London in sterling. Britain's currency came under selling pressure soon after the Labour government took office in 1964, but we had not moved out our reserves. Their forces were defending us against Indonesian confrontation, and we did not want to be blamed for precipitating a devaluation. Wilson, in a television broadcast that same Sunday evening, said, "We are now on our own. It means Britain first." This was ominous. But Healey was reassuring when he said in the House of Commons on November 27th, "I believe that the whole government share my view that we must, above all, keep faith with our forces and with our allies in making these cuts. We can have no reversal of the July decisions. That is why my right honorable friend, the Chancellor Callahan, said last Monday that the reductions must be made within the framework of the defense policies announced last summer. Let me tell the right honorable gentleman that these cuts mean no acceleration in the rundown or the redeployment of our forces." I wrote to thank Healey for his assurance. I was wrong. Healey could not speak for the government. Wilson, the Prime Minister, was out to save his government. He meant it when he said it was Britain first. Wilson also said no area of expenditure can be regarded as sacrosanct. I wrote to Wilson on December 18th to recount how the Singapore government had faithfully supported sterling and lost $57 million as a result of this devaluation. The currency board 69 million Singapore dollars, the Singapore government 65 million Singapore dollars, statutory boards 23 million Singapore dollars. My letter ended, "I would be loath to believe that temporary difficulties could disrupt the trust and confidence we have in each other's good intentions, goodwill, and good faith. I shall stand by my statement at Scarborough, and on our part we shall see that the last of the British forces will be given a ceremonial send-off when they leave their bases in the mid-70s. This was a forlorn hope. In the first major crisis of his government, Wilson had no time to save friends and allies, however faithful. Instead of replying, he sent George Thompson, the Commonwealth Relations Secretary, to see me on January 9, 1968. Thompson was apologetic and defensive. Devaluation, he said, had given the British government a chance once and for all to put the economy right. The defense cuts would mean a fundamental change in the historic role of Britain and its long-term defense structure. The British would remain in Europe, though their capability could be used to help allies outside Europe. I asked about Healey's statement about an amphibious capability in Singapore. That was to be scrapped. No naval forces would be stationed in Southeast Asia after 1971. Asked how firm the decision to pull out by 1971 was, Thompson said it was very firm, but they would take into account the views of their Commonwealth partners. Thompson was gentle and friendly in his demeanor. His sympathies were with us. It was an unpleasant task Wilson had given him. To soften the blow, Wilson invited me for discussions at Chequers, the official country home of the Prime Minister. In my frustration and anger at this total disregard for undertakings given solemnly, I said that we too could put Singapore's interests first and foremost and protect our sterling balances by moving them out of London. Nevertheless, I decided to go to London and see Wilson at Chequers. Wilson changed the venue from Chequers to 10 Downing Street on a Sunday. When I arrived at 5:30 p.m., his 3 senior ministers were present, Dennis Healy, Defense, George Brown, Foreign Affairs, and George Thompson, Commonwealth Relations. Wilson held out some hope by saying that the cabinet had agreed not to make a final decision until I had met him. I said any precipitate announcement that all British troops would be off the mainland of Asia by 1971 would shake the confidence of investors, especially those from Hong Kong, and make them go further afield. To restore confidence, Singapore would have to go for massive arms expenditure to make its defense credible. I argued that the British Armed Services owned valuable real estate in Singapore, homes and barracks worth over £5 million. If the rundown took place over 3 years, they would not fetch half this price on the open market. Wilson reiterated what Healy had told me a year earlier in Singapore, that the decision to withdraw was made on economic grounds and could not be altered. The decision on timing, March 1971, was fairly unanimous, and his ministers present represented the cabinet view. He was anxious to discuss aid to give real economic relief to Singapore. I replied that security was my main concern, for without it there would be no investments, which we needed much more than aid. Wilson left the arguments for early withdrawal to Healy while he sat back, sucked at his pipe, and looked on sympathetically. From Wilson's body language, I knew it would be impossible to keep him to his original undertaking to stay till the mid-1970s. The British ministers sympathized with my plight. The most supportive was George Brown, remembering his strong views when we met in Stockholm in 1966 that British forces should be out of Singapore. I was surprised when he asked how much time I needed. I named March 31st, 1997. Years later, he told me that U.S. President Johnson had persuaded him that while the Vietnam War continued, America could not replace British forces in the Arabian Gulf and Singapore, and that the British contribution was politically invaluable. At about 7 p.m., Roy Jenkins, who had replaced Callaghan as Chancellor of the Exchequer, joined us. He pitched in on a related subject, that Singapore's economic position stood out from those of other countries in the region. We were doing well. The position in Britain was quite serious. He compared British and Singapore reserves to show that, per capita, the figure for Britain was smaller than Singapore's. He criticized the Singapore government for investing its budgetary surplus elsewhere without informing the British government. He was on the offensive. We had never taken any of our reserves out of sterling, but we had not given any undertaking to put our budgetary surpluses into sterling. He had scored a point that we were not as helpful as we could have been and could not expect special consideration now. We talked through dinner, repeating arguments again and again as we drank liberal glasses of Claret Jenkins's favorite wine. We finished at 10:50 p.m. after 5.5 hours. Wilson, summing up, said the British government accepted the need to help maintain confidence in Singapore. But he emphasized that there could be no permanent security for Singapore except in the framework of a wider regional defense agreement with other Commonwealth countries concerned. It was inadvisable for Singapore to make hasty decisions on the purchase of military equipment before the possibility of such an arrangement had been explored in greater detail. His government would do all they reasonably could, consistent with their overriding aim, total withdrawal by 1971, to help Singapore maintain security, and hoped that the Singapore government would take full account of British advice. The next day, Monday, January 15, 1968, in the House of Commons, Healy announced that British forces east of Suez would withdraw in 1971, but he shifted the actual date for final withdrawal from March to December 1971. This difference of 9 months was significant because a general election would have to be held before December 1971. In other words, the decision on the final date of withdrawal could either be confirmed by a new Labour government or postponed by a Conservative government. I had to be satisfied with this concession. Defense correspondents reporting Healy's speech noted that he had left this opening. My trip to London had not been altogether in vain. But Wilson knew this was the end of an era. In the debate he quoted from Kipling's Recessional, "Far called our navies melt away on dune and headland sinks the fire low. All our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre." During those 5 days in London in January 1968, I worked hard to prolong the British presence. Besides discussions with Wilson, I took my case to Conservative Party leaders, primarily Ted Heath, Reginald Maudling, and Lane MacLeod. They were most sympathetic and supportive. If they were the government, they would have wished to stay longer without naming a withdrawal date. That made a difference to the actual final outcome. British television and press gave me extensive coverage. I was able to put across a reasoned, not an angry case. I tugged at the heartstrings of the British people, that our long and fruitful association should not end in an unseemly way which would damage Singapore's future. I had put on the best face possible. But Kung Sui, who flew back to Singapore ahead of me, voiced his frustrations to the press at Singapore airport. The Labour Party has gone back on its word, a disgraceful breach of an undertaking given to us. I saw no point in venting my spleen. My other colleagues, including Raja, Chin Chai, and Sui Sen, were deeply disappointed and apprehensive of the implications for our security and economy. But they did not berate the British. Angry words would only annoy British ministers and ruffle British service commanders in Singapore who, after all, were loyal Britishers. I needed goodwill and cooperation from the British to execute the withdrawal with the minimum of friction and the maximum of goodwill, and not have military workshops stripped bare as had happened in Guinea, West Africa, when the French left in the 1960s. This sudden turn of events added to the pressure on us. Our economic problems would mount, as would unemployment. Our defense problems had widened with the need for an air force. How were we to build up an air force from scratch and have a squadron of fighter aircraft operational by the end of 1971? When we saw Healy a second time about buying a squadron of Hawker Hunters, he readily agreed. He would also help build up our capability to operate them. A total change from his attitude in October 1966, less than 2 years earlier, when he had wagged his finger at us for harboring mischievous thoughts. The British media were sympathetic but on the whole pessimistic about Singapore's future. Singapore would lose about 20% of its GDP with the end of British military spending, and without British military protection, they saw the future as precarious. The chairman of the Daily Mirror Group, Cecil King, was at my press conference on my return to Singapore from London in January. He told my press secretary, Alex Josie, that his heart went out to me but the situation was hopeless. With high unemployment and no security after the withdrawal of the British, the economy must decline. King was not alone in holding such a pessimistic view of Singapore's prospects. To fill the vacuum that followed the ending of the Anglo-Malayan Defence Agreement, AMDA, the British had proposed a five-power defence arrangement, FPDA, that would be consultative, not a binding defence obligation. I knew the Australians were fearful that the Indonesians would have the wrong impression, that the five powers, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, and Singapore, were ganging up against Indonesia. In February 1968, Paul Hasluck, Australia's External Affairs Minister, when in Singapore, had told me that Australia would maintain its force levels till the end of 1971, after which his government was uncertain. In other words, the Australian forces could leave together with the British. I stressed to him that it was necessary to make clear to everyone that it was not the intention of the Western Allies to leave a vacuum in the area after 1971, which could be filled by either Russia or China or anybody else. He stressed that Malaysia-Singapore cooperation was fundamental to Australian defence planning. I assured him that we regarded any attack on Malaysia as a threat to Singapore, but I encouraged him to make it clear to the Malaysians that any bilateral agreement with Australia that excluded Singapore was simply not on. I described how on my trip to Melbourne for Prime Minister Harold Holt's memorial service in December 1967, Razak was on the same aircraft but virtually ignored me. But after McEwen, the Australian Deputy Prime Minister who was acting as Prime Minister before John Gorton took over, had rebuffed him in blunt terms when he tried for a bilateral agreement between Australia and Malaysia, Razak was all reasonableness and accommodation as he spent 3 hours in the aircraft with me discussing Malaysia's defense and security. Singapore-Malaysia bilateral relations on defense improved considerably after this. Indeed, Razak told Kim San and King Sui in March 1968 that the security of both countries was inseparable, that Malaysia could not afford heavy military expenditure in Singapore, being a small island and very vulnerable to sneak attacks, should concentrate on its air defense capability, while Malaysia with its long coastline would concentrate on its navy. This way we would complement each other. As two separate territories, we talk to one another as equals. Wherever we can agree, we work together. If we cannot agree, well, we wait a while. Shortly after the race riots in Kuala Lumpur in May 1969, followed by the suspension of the Malaysian parliament, Razak had to represent Malaysia in Canberra at a meeting of prime ministers of the five powers to discuss defense arrangements after the British pullout in 1971. Before the conference started, the Australian Permanent Secretary of Defence told us that his Prime Minister, John Gorton, would not be attending the conference. In a private discussion, the Permanent Secretary in their External Affairs Department said Gorton doubted the Malaysian government's ability to contain the situation and believed further racial trouble would break out and Singapore would be sucked into the conflict. Gorton had totally lost confidence in Malaysia. He did not want to commit Australia to any defense arrangement with Malaysia. The Australians were already most unhappy that the British were leaving the region, and they did not want to be saddled with responsibility for the defense of Malaysia and Singapore. Gorton foresaw disaster and was fearful of the electorate's reaction to any new commitments Australia might make for the defense of Malaysia and Singapore. At the last moment, however, he came to open the conference but left immediately after his speech. He stressed the need for racial harmony in the area and for a categorical assurance from Malaysia and Singapore that their defense was indivisible. Razak and his Malaysian officials looked extremely depressed. That night, I talked to Razak in his hotel room. I decided to set aside my reservations and support his bid that, after 1971, the commander for the five-power defense arrangement should be responsible to representatives of the five powers and not just to Singapore and Malaysia as Australia proposed. This cheered Razak. Toward the end of the conference, Gordon Freeth, the Australian External Affairs Minister, clarified that if Malaysia were attacked, Australian troops could be deployed in either East or West Malaysia. The Conservatives in Britain had been aghast at withdrawing their forces east of Suez. In January 1970, Edward Heath, as leader of the opposition, visited Singapore. I arranged for him to have discussions with all key ministers to get a comprehensive view of our economic development, the progress in our defense buildup, and an overview of the political and social situation. I arranged for the RAF to give him a bird's-eye view of the island from a helicopter. He was impressed and told the press he would halt Labour's policy of withdrawal from east of Suez. He said, "There won't be any question of British forces having been withdrawn and British forces coming back. It will be a question that British forces are still here and we as a Conservative government will halt the withdrawal." He added he was immensely impressed with the really remarkable achievements which had been brought to the island. The basis for all of this is confidence in the future and peace and stability in the whole area. I hoped the British service commanders would take note and not be too hurried in their withdrawal. 5 months later, in June 1970, the Conservative Party won the general election and Edward Heath became Prime Minister. His Defence Minister, Peter Carrington, visited Singapore that same month to announce that withdrawal would proceed as planned, but that Britain would retain some of its forces in Singapore on an equal basis with the Australians and New Zealanders. Privately, Carrington told me that Britain would not leave behind any fighter or transport squadrons. There would be only 4 Nimrod surveillance aircraft, a flight of Whirlwind helicopters, and a battalion would be stationed at Nay Soon, one of their camps. There would be 5 frigates/destroyers stationed throughout east of Suez, and the Anglo-Malayan Defense Agreement would be replaced by a political commitment of a consultative nature. The British made it clear they wanted to participate, not as the leader, but as a partner on an equal basis in the five-power defense arrangement being planned. In mid-April 1971, the 5 prime ministers met in London to finalize the political arrangements to replace AMOA. The operative words read, "In the event of any form of armed attack externally organized or supported, or the threat of such attack against Malaysia or Singapore, the governments would immediately consult together for the purpose of deciding what measures should be taken jointly or separately in relation to such attack or threat. To immediately consult was better than not consulting. On September 1, 1971, the Integrated Air Defense System was established. On 3 October 1, 1971, the AMOA was replaced by the FPDA. The old era of underwritten security had ended. From now on, we had to be responsible for our own security. But security was not our only concern. We had to make a living, to persuade investors to put their money into manufacturing plants and other businesses in Singapore. We had to learn to survive, without the British military umbrella and without a hinterland.
Chapter 4. Surviving without a hinterland. For surviving without a hinterland in 1965, a few months after independence, an economic planner whom the Indian government had seconded to us presented me with a thick volume of his report. I scanned the summary to confirm that his plans were based on a common market with Malaysia. I thanked him and never read it again. He did not understand that if Malaysia was not willing to have a common market while Singapore was a part of it, it was hardly likely to agree now we were independent. We were stripped of our role as the administrative, commercial, and military hub of the British Empire in Southeast Asia. Unless we could find and attach ourselves to a new hinterland, the future was bleak. A few weeks earlier, I had met Dr. Albert Winsemius, our Dutch economic advisor. He painted a grim but not hopeless picture. Because of confrontation by Indonesia, unemployment had risen. If we continued with no common market with Malaysia and no trade with Indonesia, by the end of 1966 unemployment would exceed 14%. This would mean social unrest. Singapore is walking on a razor's edge, he said. He recommended a common market agreement with Malaysia, which was a non-starter, and a resumption of barter trade with Indonesia. He also advised that we seek more favorable entry for Singapore manufactured goods into the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Winsemius first came to Singapore in 1960 when he led a United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, mission to advise us on industrialization. I remember his first report to me in 1961 when he laid two preconditions for Singapore's success: first, to eliminate the communists who made any economic progress impossible; second, not to remove the statue of Stamford Raffles. To tell me in 1961, when the Communist United Front was at the height of its power and pulverizing the PAP government day after day, that I should eliminate the communists left me speechless as I laughed at the absurdity of his simple solution. To keep Raffles' statue was easy. My colleagues and I had no desire to rewrite the past and perpetuate ourselves by renaming streets or buildings or putting our faces on postage stamps or currency notes. Winsemius said we would need large-scale technical, managerial, entrepreneurial, and marketing know-how from America and Europe. Investors wanted to see what a new socialist government in Singapore was going to do to the statue of Raffles. Letting it remain would be a symbol of public acceptance of the British heritage and could have a positive effect. I had not looked at it that way, but was quite happy to leave this monument because he was the founder of modern Singapore. If Raffles had not come here in 1819 to establish a trading post, my great-grandfather would not have migrated to Singapore from Dapu County in Guangdong Province, southeast China. The British created an emporium that offered him, and many thousands like him, the opportunity to make a better living than in their homeland, which was going through turmoil and chaos as the Qing dynasty declined and disintegrated. Now, in 1965, we too faced a future so bleak that I asked Kim San, then Minister of Finance, to send a trade delegation from our four chambers of commerce and the Manufacturers Association to Africa on the off chance of picking up some business. The delegation went to East and West African countries, but little trade followed. After grappling with the problem of unemployment for years since we first took office in 1959, all of us in the cabinet knew that the only way to survive was to industrialize. We had reached the limits of our entrepot trade. the outlook was a further decline. Confrontation from Indonesia was still on, and the Malaysians were determined to bypass Singapore. We cast around for solutions and were willing to try any practical idea that could create jobs and enable us to pay our way. One of our soft drink manufacturers suggested to me that we promote tourism. It was labor intensive, needing cooks, maids, waiters, laundrymen, dry cleaners, tour guides, drivers, and makers of souvenir handicraft. Best of all, it required little capital. We formed the Singapore Tourist Promotion Board and appointed our film magnate, Runme Shaw of Shaw Brothers, as chairman. He was the right man for the job. He was in the film and entertainment industry and knew all about the packaging and selling of sights and sounds, and how to keep visitors amused while in a strange country. He had a logo designed, the Merlion, a lion with a mermaid's tail. I launched the logo erected in concrete at the mouth of the Singapore River. I did little else for the tourist industry except to speak at the occasional convention of visiting professionals or business people. To my relief, it did create many jobs and put coins into many empty pockets. It reduced but did not solve the unemployment problem. For that, we concentrated on getting factories started. Despite our small domestic market of 2 million, we protected locally assembled cars, refrigerators, air conditioners, radios, television sets, and tape recorders, in the hope that they would later be partly manufactured locally. We encouraged our own business people who set up small factories to manufacture vegetable oils, cosmetics, mosquito coils, hair cream, joss paper, and even mothballs. And we were able to attract Hong Kong and Taiwanese investors to build factories for toys, textiles, and garments. It was an unpromising start. The Jurong industrial estate in the west of Singapore was empty in spite of the vast sums we had spent on infrastructure. We had more than our share of failures. Short of water and too small to tolerate heavy pollution of coastal waters, the Economic Development Board, EDB, nevertheless went into a joint venture to recycle paper products, with a businessman who had no manufacturing experience. It also invested in ceramics when we did not have the technical know-how. Both ventures failed. We had a joint venture with IHI, Ishikawajima Harima Heavy Industries, in Jurong Shipyard for shipbuilding and ship repairing, and started to build 14,000 DWT, deadweight tons, Freedom-type vessels, and later 90,000 DWT tankers. But Singapore produced neither steel plates nor engines and had to import them from Japan. After 16 Freedom-type vessels and 3 tankers, we stopped building ships, except for small vessels of 10,000 DWT. It was not profitable, unlike ship repairing, for which the labor content was high. In the early years, any factory was welcome. For example, when I was in London in January 1968 to discuss the British withdrawal, Marcus Seif, the chairman of Marks & Spencer's, saw me at my London hotel. He had seen me on BBC television. He suggested that as Chinese had nimble fingers, Singapore could go into making fish hooks and lures for trout fishing. This was high-value work because the feathers had to be skillfully attached to the hooks. There were other such products that did not require much capital equipment but created many jobs. His retail network could help market the goods. I must have looked forlorn on television for him to have taken the time to see me. I thanked him, but nothing came of it. Not long after, a Norwegian manufacturer of fish hooks, Mustard, set up a factory in Singapore, employing several hundred workers to make millions of fish hooks of all shapes and sizes, though not with feathers for trout fishing. The loss of British military expenditure between 1968 and 1971 was a blow to our economy. It was some 20% of our GDP, providing over 30,000 jobs in direct employment and another 40,000 in support services. I was determined that our attitude to British aid, indeed any aid, should be the opposite of Malta's. When I visited Malta in 1967 to see how it had sorted out its problems after the rundown of the British forces, I was astounded. The Suez Canal had been closed as a result of the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War 3 months earlier, in June. Ships were no longer going through the canal, hence the dockyard in Malta was closed, but dock workers on full pay were playing water polo in the dry dock which they had filled with water. I was shaken by their aid dependency, banking on continuing charity from the British. The British had given fairly generous redundancy payments, including 5 weeks' salary for each year of service, and had also covered the cost of 3 months retraining in Maltese government institutions. This nurtured a sense of dependency, not a spirit of self-reliance. Healy in 1967 had promised significant aid to offset the loss from the rundown of British forces. I was convinced our people must never have an aid-dependent mentality. If we were to succeed, we had to depend on ourselves. Even before talks on British aid commenced, I had said in Parliament on the 9th of September, 1967, there was a thriving Singapore before the bases were built and manned. If we set about it intelligently and in good heart, there will be a bigger and economically more self-reliant Singapore after the bases have been run down. My attitude was that we wanted the British to give us the earliest notice of those facilities, like the naval dockyard, they would find redundant and hand them over to civilian management while still in military use. Next, assistance should provide Singapore with jobs through industries and not make us dependent on perpetual injections of aid. I warned our workers, the world does not owe us a living. We cannot live by the begging bowl. Hun Sway Sen, our most capable permanent secretary, drew up a list of British assets that could be converted to civilian use. The British outlined their approach to the 15,000 acres of real estate they occupied, 1% of Singapore's total area. Land to be used for economic or defence purposes would be made available without charge. The Singapore government was to help sell the remaining land on the open market. But in January 1968, before the negotiations were concluded, the British announced their total withdrawal by 1971. On my return to Singapore that January, I said in a broadcast, if we were a soft society then we would already have perished. A soft people will vote for those who promised a soft way out, when in truth there is none. There is nothing Singapore gets for free, even our water we pay for. There will be a throbbing and humming industrial, commercial and communication centre long after the British have gone. I felt strongly that the people's morale and confidence would be decisive in the coming battle for Singapore's survival. That February, we formed the base's Economic Conversion Department with Sway Sen in charge. I placed it under my portfolio in the Prime Minister's office to give Sway Sen more clout when dealing with other ministries. His job was to retrain and redeploy redundant workers, take possession of land and other assets the British were vacating, put them to the best use, and negotiate mitigatory aid. It was important we did not generate rancor and friction over the handover of properties or the provision of aid. To do so would undermine confidence, and whatever aid we might get could never make up for the loss of confidence if relations with the British soured. Moreover, I still hoped for some residual presence of British, Australian, and New Zealand forces after 1971. I told the newly arrived British High Commissioner, Sir Arthur de la Mare, in February 1968 that Singapore would accept whatever his government gave, but would not press chemistry. I asked that his government leave whatever it had no further use for instead of destroying it as was the practice. This would create goodwill and sustain pro-British sentiments in Singapore. By March 1968 the discussions concluded with a £50 million aid package to be spent on British goods and services. Of KAIs, 25% were grants, 75% loans. We spent half on development projects and half on British defence equipment. The British agreed to hand over the naval dockyard at Sembawang, including 2 valuable floating docks the Royal Navy could easily have towed away, provided the Singapore government appointed Swan and Hunter as managing agents under a 5-year contract. I had met Sir John Hunter when I was in London in June 1967, and again in October when I visited his dockyards on Tyneside after the Labour Party conference in Scarborough. The Americans, who were anxious to keep the naval dockyard viable, sent Army and Navy teams in January and February to inspect the facilities. In April 1968, Sui Sen told me the United States would test Yu Sembawang's ship repair facilities from April to June 1968 and provide $4 to $5 million Singapore dollars of business. That was most encouraging. This conversion of the naval dockyard to civilian use was successful. Swan and Hunter prospered both at Keppel, our civilian dockyard, and at Sembawang. When 2 5-year contracts ended in 1978, one of their top managers, Neville Watson, stayed on with Sembawang Shipyard Limited, the company we had formed to run the dockyard. Eventually he became its chief executive. The company prospered and grew to become Sembcorp Industries, a conglomerate listed on the Stock Exchange of Singapore. Blakang Mati, behind death, an island off Singapore's harbour housing a British Gurkha battalion, became Sentosa, Tranquility, a tourist resort. Dr. Win Semius got me to stop it from becoming a military training area, a casino, or an oil refinery. Proposals put up by various miniseries to the base's economic conversion unit under Sway Senator I did not need persuading to veto these proposals. Fort Canning, with all its tunnels and bunkers, the British Army headquarters before the Japanese capture of Singapore, has also been preserved, the buildings turned into a clubhouse for leisure and recreation. Seletar Military Airfield was converted to civilian use for small cargo planes and small commercial aircraft. The RAF Changi Air Base has been expanded by land reclamation and developed into Changi International Airport with 2 runways. The Pasir Panjang Military Complex is now the National University of Singapore campus at Kent Ridge with 26,000 students. In his quiet, methodical way, Sway Sen converted the real estate to economic use, and his EDB staff attracted investors from around the world to set up industries on former British Army land. It was our good fortune that the real estate handover started in 1968 and was completed by 197 before the oil crisis in 1973. A buoyant world economy, with world trade expanding at about 8 to 10% per annum, made it easier to convert them to civilian use. The withdrawal was carried out with goodwill on both sides. The 30,000 retrenched workers were absorbed by industries we attracted from abroad. When the withdrawal was completed in 1971, our people were quietly confident. There was no unemployment, and no land or building was left idle or derelict. The single British battalion with a squadron of helicopters, together with the Australian and New Zealand battalions that formed the FPDA, contributed to stability and security. After I had settled policies to counter the loss of British military spending, in the autumn of 1968, I took a short sabbatical at Harvard. I had been in office for 9 years and needed to recharge my batteries, get some fresh ideas and reflect on the future. The Kennedy School of Government made me an honorary fellow and arranged breakfasts, lunches, dinners, and seminars for me to meet a host of distinguished scholars. During the exchanges, they sparked off many useful and interesting ideas. I learned much about American society and economy by reading and talking to Harvard Business School professors such as Professor Ray Vernon. Vernon gave me a valuable lesson on the ever-changing nature of technology, industry, and markets, and how costs, especially wages in labor-intensive industries, determine profits. That was how Hong Kong entrepreneurs were able to build up such a successful textile and garments industry. They had been nimble, changing their produce lines, patterns, and designs with changing fashions. It was a never-ending competition against equally agile and lower-cost producers in Taiwan and South Korea. And their sales promoters were frequently flying to consult their buyers in New York and big cities. He dispelled my previous belief that industries changed gradually and seldom moved from an advanced country to a less developed one. Reliable and cheap air and sea transport made it possible to move industries into new countries, provided their people were disciplined and trained to work the machines, and there was a stable and efficient government to facilitate the process for foreign entrepreneurs. On my first official visit to America in October 1967, I recounted to 50 business people at a luncheon in Chicago how Singapore had grown from a village of 120 fishermen in 1819 to become a metropolis of 2 million. This was because its philosophy was to provide goods and services cheaper and better than anyone else, or perish. They responded well because I was not putting my hand out for aid, which they had come to expect of leaders from newly independent countries. I noted their favorable reaction to my no-begging bowl approach. In November 1968, I went to New York to address some 800 top decision-makers at the Economic Club of New York. My hard-headed and realistic analysis of Singapore's problems and the dangers in the region, especially the war in Vietnam, was well received. I took pains to end on a sober but upbeat note, painting a silver lining on somber clouds. I answered their difficult questions frankly and directly. Several of the executives wrote to congratulate me, and after that night Chan Chin Bok, our EDB chief in New York, found it much easier to get access to top American executives. Thereafter, every time I visited America, he would arrange for me to meet 20 to 50 executives. The usual format was drinks before lunch or dinner, conversation at the main table with the important CEOs, then a 20-minute speech followed by questions and answers. Chin Bok explained that most American CEOs had no time to visit Singapore, but they wanted to see and assess the man in charge before they set up a factory there. My meetings were productive because Winsemius had told me how their minds worked. His son was working for a large American business consultancy firm and knew exactly how Americans weighed business risks. They looked for political, economic, and financial stability and sound labor relations to make sure that there would be no disruption in production that supplied their customers and subsidiaries around the world. That December, I met another group of American executives in the Far East American Council. Originally only 100 were to attend. After that economic club dinner, word got around that I was worth listening to, and the numbers swelled to 200. In a note to the cabinet I grumbled, eating and talking through the meal while conserving energy and not letting myself go and drink in case I lose my sharp cutting edge is quite a strain. It is part of the price to promote American investments. After several years of disheartening trial and error, we concluded that Singapore's best hope lay with the American multinational corporations, MNCs. When the Taiwanese and Hong Kong entrepreneurs came in the 1960s, they brought low technology such as textile and toy manufacturing, labor-intensive but not large-scale. American MNCs brought higher technology in large-scale operations, creating many jobs. They had weight and confidence. They believed that their government was going to stay in Southeast Asia and their businesses were safe from confiscation or war loss. I gradually crystallized my thoughts and settled on a two-pronged strategy to overcome our disadvantages. The first was to leapfrog the region, as the Israelis had done. This idea sprang from a discussion I had with a UNDP expert who visited Singapore in 1962. In 1964, while on a tour of Africa, I met him again in Malawi. He described to me how the Israelis, faced with a more hostile environment than ours, had found a way around their difficulties by leaping over their Arab neighbors who boycotted them, to trade with Europe and America. Since our neighbors were out to reduce their ties with us, we had to link up with the developed world, America, Europe, and Japan, and attract their manufacturers to produce in Singapore and export their products to the developed countries. The accepted wisdom of development economists at the time was that MNCs were exploiters of cheap land, labor, and raw materials. This dependency school of economists argued that MNCs continued the colonial pattern of exploitation that left the developing countries selling raw materials to and buying consumer goods from the advanced countries. MNCs controlled technology and consumer preferences and formed alliances with their host governments to exploit the people and keep them down. Third world leaders believed this theory of neo-colonialist exploitation, but Kung Sui and I were not impressed. We had a real-life problem to solve and could not afford to be conscribed by any theory or dogma. Anyway, Singapore had no natural resources for MNCs to exploit. All it had were hard-working people, good basic infrastructure, and a government that was determined to be honest and competent. Our duty was to create a livelihood for 2 million Singaporeans. If MNCs could give our workers employment and teach them technical and engineering skills and management know-how, we should bring in the MNCs. The second part of my strategy was to create a first world oasis in a third world region. This was something Israel could not do because it was at war with its neighbors. If Singapore could establish first world standards in public and personal security, health, education, telecommunications, transportation, and services, it would become a base camp for entrepreneurs, engineers, managers, and other professionals who had business to do in the region. This meant we had to train our people and equip them to provide first world standards of service. I believed this was possible, that we could re-educate and reorientate our people with the help of schools, trade unions, community centers, and social organizations. If the communists in China could eradicate all flies and sparrows, surely we could get our people to change their third world habits. We had one simple guiding principle for survival, that Singapore had to be more rugged, better organized, and more efficient than others in the region. If we were only as good as our neighbors, there was no reason for businesses to be based here. We had to make it possible for investors to operate successfully and profitably in Singapore despite our lack of a domestic market and natural resources. We had established the Economic Development Board by statute in August 1961. Winsemius had recommended a one-stop agency so that an investor need not deal with a large number of departments and ministries. This agency would sort out all an investor's requirements, whether related to land, power, water, or environmental and work safety. For the first few months, the EDB had experts from the UNDP and the International Labour Office to help it. The EDB's main efforts were in investment promotion, concentrating on the four industries Winsemius had named in his report: shipbreaking and repair, metal engineering, chemicals, and electrical equipment and appliances. Hun Sui Sen was picked by King Sui as the first chairman of the EDB and given the choice of the brightest and best of our scholars who had returned from universities in Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These young men were inspired by Sui Sen, a quiet, outstanding administrator with an amazing ability to get the best out of those who worked for him. He shaped the culture of the EDB, their enthusiasm, the unflagging spirit, the ingenious ways they got around obstacles to promote investments and create jobs. He made the EDB so successful and large that he had to break off different components of the organization, turning the Industrial Estate section into the Jurong Town Corporation and the Development Finance section into the Development Bank of Singapore, DBS. Both became leaders in their own fields. DBS helped finance our entrepreneurs who needed venture capital because our established banks had no experience outside trade financing and were too conservative and reluctant to lend to would-be manufacturers. It was hard legwork for our young EDB officers to interest foreign investors in the opportunities in Singapore, to persuade them to send missions here to see for themselves. When Chin Bok first began visiting corporate offices, the CEOs did not even know where Singapore was. He had to point it out on their globes, a little dot at the tip of the Malay Peninsula in Southeast Asia. EDB officers would sometimes call on 40 to 50 companies before getting one to visit Singapore. They worked with inexhaustible energy because they felt the survival of Singapore depended upon them. Ngiam Tong Dao, a young EDB director, later permanent secretary of the Ministry of Trade and Industry, remembered what Keng Sui told him, that every time he drove by a school and saw hundreds of children streaming out, he felt downhearted, wondering how to find jobs for them when they left school. The EDB officers had imbibed the values and attitudes of the ministers, a willingness to learn from others and a readiness to accept assistance from any quarter. They were helped by their English language education. We had inherited the English language from the British and had adopted it as our common working language. From the able team in the EDB, I later found 3 cabinet ministers, S. Danabalan, Lee Yok-swan, and Yo Chio Tong. Several EDB officers, including Zhou Pile and Jiam Tong Dao, became outstanding permanent secretaries. In addition, Pillay was chairman of Singapore Airlines, where his financial and business skills made it the most profitable airline in Asia, while Jiam became chairman of the Development Bank of Singapore. Winsemius played a crucial role as economic advisor, serving for 23 years until 1984. He visited Singapore twice a year, each time for about 3 weeks. We paid for his air tickets and hotel bills in Singapore, but for nothing else. To keep him up to date, Jiam, his EDB liaison officer, sent him regular reports and daily copies of the Straits Times. His practice was to spend his first week in Singapore in discussions with our officials, the next with executives of MNCs and some Singapore companies, and also with NTUC, National Trades Union Congress, leaders. He would submit his report and recommendations to the Minister of Finance and to me. Then I would have a working lunch with him alone. The top executives of the MNCs soon appreciated the value of his role and spoke freely to him of their problems: overregulation by the government, the rising value of the Singapore dollar, too much job hopping, too restrictive a policy on employing foreign workers, and so on. Winsemius had a pragmatic, hands-on approach, a good head for figures, and a knack for getting to grips with the basic issues, ignoring the mass of details. Most of all, he was wise and canny. I learned much from him, especially about how European and American CEOs think and operate. In between his visits to Singapore, he would meet me whenever my work took me to London, Paris, Brussels, or Amsterdam. He had to endure one hardship: he was a chain smoker and I was allergic to smoke, so for him our working meals were a real deprivation. Whenever possible, the lunch or dinner would be al fresco, to let him smoke. He spoke English fluently if ungrammatically and with a heavy Dutch accent. He had a deep, guttural voice, a leathery face with deeply lined forehead and cheeks, horn-rimmed glasses, and hair combed straight back. He once told me he could not explain why he felt a great affinity with Sui Sen and me, and could only conclude that there was a congruence of the Calvinistic and Confucian philosophy of life. Whatever the reason, it was Singapore's good fortune that he enjoyed working with us. The government played a key role in attracting foreign investments. We built the infrastructure and provided well-planned industrial estates, equity participation in industries, fiscal incentives, and export promotion. Most important, we established good labor relations and sound macroeconomic policies, the fundamentals that enable private enterprise to operate successfully. Our largest infrastructure development was the Jurong Industrial Estate, which eventually covered 9,000 acres, with roads, sewers, drainage, power, gas, and water all laid out. It had a slow start. By 1961, we had issued only 12 pioneer certificates. During 1963 to 1965, our years in Malaysia, none were issued by the central government in Kuala Lumpur. As finance minister, Keng Swee used to attend the foundation-laying ceremony and later the official opening of the factory, to create 2 occasions for publicity over one factory. He did this even for the smallest factory employing a mere handful of workers, like the one making mothballs. When Jurong lay largely empty, people called it Gob's Folly, as Keng Swee himself recalled after investments had flowed in. He was not that self-deprecatory when Jurong was barren. By the end of 1970, however, we had issued 390 pioneer certificates giving investors tax-free status for up to 5 years, extended to 10 years for those issued after 1975. Jurong was humming with activity. Our break came with a visit by Texas Instruments in October 1968. It wanted to set up a plant to assemble semiconductors, at that time a high-technology product, and was able to start production within 50 days of its decision. Close on its heels came National Semiconductor. Soon after, its competitor, Hewlett-Packard, HP, sent out a scout. Our EDB officer had worked on him, getting him any information he needed immediately, and would not give up until he agreed to visit Singapore to see for himself. He was as impressed as Texas Instruments. An EDB project officer was assigned to look after his delegation, and everything was made convenient and swift. While HP negotiated to acquire a site for its own factory, it decided to lease the top 2 floors of a 6-story building. The elevator to lift the heavy machinery needed a big transformer for electricity, but there was none in place in time for the visit of Mr. Hewlett himself. Rather than have him walk up 6 flights of stairs, the EDB got a gigantic cable extended from a neighboring building, and on the day of the visit the elevator worked. Hewlett-Packard invested. These stories went through the boardrooms of the American electronics industry, and other American electronics companies soon followed. During this period, China was in the mad throes of Mao's Cultural Revolution. Most investors thought Taiwan and Hong Kong too close to China and headed for Singapore. We welcomed everyone, but when we found a big investor with potential for growth, we went out of our way to help it get started. By the 1970s, glowing reports on Singapore had appeared in American magazines, including U.S. News and World Report, Harper's, and Time. In 1970, General Electric, GE, set up 6 different facilities for electrical and electronic products, circuit breakers, and electric motors. By the late 1970s, GE was to become the largest single employer of labor in Singapore. American MNCs laid the foundations for Singapore's large high-tech electronics industry. Although we did not know it then, the electronics industry was to mop up our unemployment and turn Singapore into a major electronics exporter in the 1980s. From Singapore they were later to expand into Malaysia and Thailand. Visiting CEOs used to call on me before they made their investment decisions. I thought the best way to convince them was to ensure that the roads from the airport to their hotel and to my office were neat and spruce, lined with shrubs and trees. When they drove into the Elstana domain, they would see right in the heart of the city a green oasis, 90 acres of immaculate rolling lawns and woodland, and nestling between them a 9-hole golf course. Without a word being said, they would know that Singaporeans were competent, disciplined, and reliable, a people who would learn the skills they required soon enough. American manufacturing investment soon overtook those of the British, Dutch, and Japanese. We had carried the burden of unemployment from the time we first took office in 1959, so many young people seeking jobs that were not there. But by 1971, when the British forces left, I felt we had turned a corner. The number of unemployed did not rise, although the British had discharged their 30,000 workers and left another 40,000 without jobs, people who had served them. The American electronics companies had generated so many jobs that unemployment was no longer an issue. Then suddenly the Arab oil embargo struck, following the Arab-Israeli War of October 1973. The quadrupling of the price of oil set back the world economy. We urged our people to conserve energy and reduce consumption of fuel and electricity. There was belt-tightening but no hardship. Economic growth slowed down significantly from 13% 1972 to 4% 197.5, while inflation rose from 2.1% 1972 to 22% 1974. To my relief, we did not suffer a big loss of jobs. Our unemployment rate remained around 4.5%. After recovery in 1975, we could afford to be more selective. When our EDB officer asked how much longer we had to maintain protective tariffs for the car assembly plant owned by a local company, the finance director of Mercedes-Benz said brusquely, "Forever, because our workers were not as efficient as Germans." We did not hesitate to remove the tariffs and allow the plant to close down. Soon afterward we also phased out protection for the assembly of refrigerators, air conditioners, television sets, radios, and other consumer electrical and electronic products. By the late 1970s, we had left our old problems of unemployment and lack of investments behind us. The new problem was how to improve the quality of the new investments and with it the education and skill levels of our workers. We had found our new hinterland in America, Europe, and Japan. Modern communications and transportation made it possible for us to link up with these once faraway countries. In 1997, we had nearly 200 American manufacturing companies with over 19 billion Singapore dollar worth of investments at book value. Not only were they the largest of our foreign investors, they constantly upgraded their technology and products. This reduced their unit labor costs, enabling them to pay higher wages without losing competitiveness. Japanese investments were modest in the 1960s and 1970s, well behind those of the British and the Dutch. I tried hard to get the Japanese interested, but they were not moving in strength into Southeast Asia to manufacture for export. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Japanese invested overseas merely to sell in domestic markets and did not invest much in Singapore because of our small market. But the success of the American MNCs later encouraged the Japanese to manufacture in Singapore for export to the United States, then Europe, and only much later to Japan. China opened up in the 1980s and Japanese investment started to trickle in. When the Japanese yen appreciated against all other major currencies as a result of the Plaza Accord in 1985, Japanese manufacturers relocated their middle technology factories to Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, and Singapore, and their lower technology ones to Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia. When they discovered that their investments in Asia yielded much higher returns than those in America and Europe, East Asia became their major destination. By the mid-1990s, they had become the largest investors in manufacturing in East Asia. Our earliest investors had been the British. After the British forces withdrew from Singapore, many of their companies also left, following their flag. I had tried hard to get them to invest, but they were suffering from a withdrawal syndrome, retreating from empire back to the security of their home base, which for them was then not productive because of trade union problems. Only after Singapore showed it could make the grade did the British come back in earnest in the late 1970s, this time not to process or trade in raw materials, but to manufacture high-value-added products such as pharmaceuticals. Beecham Pharmaceuticals set up a technologically advanced operation to manufacture semisynthetic penicillin for the Asian market, especially Japan. It was the British, Dutch, and French who first came and incorporated these countries into the world economies through their empires. These former imperial powers, however, were slow to adjust to the new trade and investment patterns of the post-colonial era, and left the fields they had plowed to be sown by the Americans and the Japanese. Several well-established MNCs in Singapore were victims of worldwide restructuring, technological discoveries, or market shifts. One example stands out in my memory. After several years, the EDB finally convinced Rolly, the German camera manufacturer, to relocate in Singapore. High German wages had made them uncompetitive. I visited Rolly work in Brunswick in 1970, just before Rolly started to transfer its entire production to Singapore to manufacture cameras, flash guns, projectors, lenses, and shutters, and to produce cameras for other famous German camera brands. Together with the EDB, Rolly set up a center to train workers in precision mechanics, precision optics, toolmaking, and electromechanics. Rolly, Singapore, made excellent cameras, but changes in the market and in technology caused poor sales. Its R&D was in Germany, its production base in Singapore. This led to poor planning and coordination. It concentrated its R&D on the slower-moving, professional photographic equipment area, whereas the Japanese moved into ever simpler cameras with viewfinders and other gadgets like autofocus and talking rangefinders, all made possible by the computer chip the Germans were slow to develop. After 11 years, Rolly, both in Germany and Singapore, went into receivership. Rolly's failure was a great blow for Singapore because European investors interpreted it as a failure in the transfer of technology from Europeans to Singaporeans. The EDB had a difficult time explaining that Rolly's failure was because of changes in technology and markets. One consolation was that the 4,000 workers trained in precision engineering became a valuable base for the disk drive industry that arrived in Singapore in the 1980s. The EDB has been our primary agency to attract a steady flow of ever higher value-added investments. This has enabled Singapore to remain competitive in spite of rising wages and other costs. The officers are still some of the brightest of our graduates, mostly from universities in America, Britain, and Europe. The EDB's present chairman, Kuan Yew, is well known to CEOs of MNCs as energetic and dependable, able to deliver whatever the EDB has promised. Looking back, I cannot claim that our economic development and industrialization worked as we had planned. The early plans before separation were made on the assumption of a common market with Malaysia. Guinness had already paid a deposit for a site in Jurong for a brewery. When Tan Siew Sin, the Malaysian finance minister, told Alan Lennox Boyd, the Guinness chairman, that he would not allow even one bottle of stout to be imported. So Lennox Boyd set up his brewery in Kuala Lumpur and offered to allow us to forfeit his deposit. We returned it. Years later we repaid Tan Siew Sin's compliment when we refused to reduce the import duty on stout from Malaysia. Guinness settled on a Singapore brewery to produce it for them under license. We left most of the picking of winners to the MNCs that brought them to Singapore. A few, such as ship repairing, oil refining and petrochemicals, and banking and finance, were picked by the EDB or Sway Sen, our Minister of Finance, or myself personally. Our Ministry of Trade and Industry believed there could be breakthroughs in biotechnology, computer products, specialty chemicals, and telecommunication equipment and services. When we were unsure how new research and development would turn out, we spread our bets. Our job was to plan the broad economic objectives and the target periods within which to achieve them. We reviewed these plans regularly and adjusted them as new realities changed the outlook. Infrastructure and the training and education of workers to meet the needs of employers had to be planned years in advance. We did not have a group of ready-made entrepreneurs such as Hong Kong gained in the Chinese industrialists and bankers who came fleeing from Shanghai, Canton, and other cities when the communists took over. Had we waited for our traders to learn to be industrialists, we would have starved. It is absurd for critics to suggest in the 1990s that had we grown our own entrepreneurs, we would have been less at the mercy of the ruthless MNCs. Even with the experienced talent Hong Kong received in Chinese refugees, its manufacturing technology level is not in the same class as that of the MNCs in Singapore. The government took the lead by starting new industries such as steel mills, national iron and steel mills, and service industries such as a shipping line, Neptune Orient Lines, NOL, and an airline, Singapore Airlines, SIA. Two ministers were outstanding in their versatility. Hun Sway Sen seeded the Development Bank of Singapore, the Insurance Corporation of Singapore, and the Singapore Petroleum Company. Go! Keng Swee conceived of our shipping line, NOL, and through the Pakistani government, recruited Captain M.J. Soyi to start it up. With the help of Sir Lawrence Hartnett, an Australian expert in ordnance production, Keng Swee set up Chartered Industries of Singapore, CIS, a mint, and a factory for small ammunition, placed together because both required tight security and good production tooling. With a practical and resourceful executive director, Ong Kar Kok, CIS succeeded. Kuan Yew, a young permanent secretary, and later chairman of the EDB, took over CIS from Ong Kar Kok and added new activities that later spun off into Singapore Technologies, a high-tech company that, among other things, set up wafer fabrication plants in joint venture with top MNCs. We had to put our faith in our young officers who had integrity, intellect, energy, drive, and application but no record of business acumen. Our top scholars had been chosen from the best of each year's crop of students and sent to the top universities in Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, France, Italy, and Japan, and later, when we could afford it, America. We made them our entrepreneurs to start up successful companies like NOL and SIA. I was fearful that these enterprises would result in subsidized and loss-making nationalized corporations, as had happened in many new countries. Sui Sen, who knew his young officers, assured me that it was possible to succeed, that they could match our competitors in these businesses. And he had given clear instructions that the enterprises had to be profitable or be shut down. Both Kung Sui and Kim San, with whom I discussed these bold plans, thought it worth the risk, given the dearth of entrepreneurs. I relied on the judgment of Sui Sen, who had picked the officers for the jobs. The project succeeded. As a result, many new companies sprang up under the auspices of other ministers and their ministries. When these also were successful, we turned state monopolies such as the PUB, Public Utilities Board, the PSA, Port of Singapore Authority, and Singapore Telecom into separate entities, free from ministerial control, to be run as companies, efficient, profitable, and competitive. The key to success was the quality of the people in charge. Not all our top administrators possess business acumen, an intangible gift. Several did. National Iron and Steel Mills with Hao Yun Chong as chairman. Keppel Corporation with Sim Ki Boon, and Singapore Airlines with Joe Pillay became household names, leading stocks on the main board of the Stock Exchange of Singapore. When SIA was privatized, we had difficulty finding top-quality executives to replace Joe Pillay, such was the scarcity of entrepreneurial talent. If I have to choose one word to explain why Singapore succeeded, it is confidence. This was what made foreign investors site their factories and refineries here. Within days of the oil crisis in October 1973, I decided to give a clear signal to the oil companies that we did not claim any special privilege over the stocks of oil they held in their Singapore refineries. If we blocked export from those stocks, we would have enough oil for our own consumption for 2 years, but we would have shown ourselves to be completely undependable. I met the CEOs or managing directors of all the oil refineries Shell, Mobil, Esso, Singapore Petroleum, and British Petroleum on the 10th of November, 1973. I assured them publicly that Singapore would share in any cuts they imposed on the rest of their customers, on the principle of equal misery. Their customers were in countries as far apart as Alaska, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, besides those in the region. This decision increased international confidence in the Singapore government, that it knew its long-term interest depended on being a reliable place for oil and other business. As a result, the oil industry confidently expanded into petrochemicals in the late 1970s. By the 1990s, with a total refining capacity of 1.2 million barrels per day, Singapore had become the world's third largest oil refining center after Houston and Rotterdam, the third largest oil trading center after New York and London, and the largest fuel oil bunker market in volume terms. Singapore is also a major petrochemical producer. To overcome the natural doubts of investors from advanced countries over the quality of our workers, I had asked the Japanese, Germans, French, and Dutch to set up centers in Singapore with their own instructors to train technicians. Some centers were government-financed, others were jointly formed with such corporations as Philips, Rolly, and Tata. After 4 to 6 months of training, these workers, who were trained in a factory-like environment, became familiar with the work systems and cultures of the different nations and were desirable employees. These training institutes became useful points of reference for investors from these countries to check how our workers compared with theirs. They validated the standards of Singapore workers.
Chapter 5. Creating a Financial Center. 5. Creating a financial center. Anyone who predicted in 1965, when we separated from Malaysia, that Singapore would become a financial center would have been thought mad. How did it happen? The gleaming modern office blocks in the city center with banks of computers linking Singapore with London, New York, Tokyo, Frankfurt, Hong Kong, and other major financial centers. It had a most improbable start in 1968. In his oral history, Dr. Winsemius recalls his telephone call to his friend, the vice president of the Bank of America branch in Singapore, who was then in London. "Look here, Mr. Van Enen, we Singapore want, within 10 years, to be the financial center in Southeast Asia. Van Enen replied, "All right, you come to London. In 5 years you can develop it." Winsemius immediately went to London, where Van Enen took him to a large globe standing in a boardroom and said, "Look here, the financial world begins in Zurich. Zurich banks open at 9 o'clock in the morning, later Frankfurt, later London. In the afternoon Zurich closes, then Frankfurt and London. In the meantime, New York is open. So London hands over financial money traffic to New York. In the afternoon, New York closes. They had already handed over to San Francisco. When San Francisco closes in the afternoon, the world is covered with a veil. Nothing happens until next day, 9 a.m. Swiss time. Then the Swiss banks open. If we put Singapore in between, before San Francisco closes, Singapore would have taken over. And when Singapore closes, it would have handed over to Zurich. Then, for the first time since creation, we will have a 24-hour round-the-world service in money and banking." A.C. Winsemius's request, Van Enen wrote a paper on the subject and sent it to Hans Sui-san, chairman of the EDB, and Winsemius's special link to me. Sui-san saw me to propose that we lift foreign exchange control restrictions on all currency transactions between Singapore and territories outside the sterling area. We were still pair of the sterling area that required exchange controls on the movement of money. When Sui-san sounded out a Bank of England official on the possibility of setting up a foreign currency pool like Hong Kong's, which would allow us to have an Asian dollar market, he was cold that Hong Kong's arrangement was allowed for historical reasons, and warned that Singapore might have to leave the sterling area. I decided the risk was worth taking and told Sui-san to go ahead. The Bank of England did not force the issue, and Singapore did not have to leave the sterling bloc. In any case, Britain dissolved it 4 years later. Unlike Hong Kong, Singapore could neither ride on the reputation of the City of London, an established financial center with its long history of international banking, nor depend on the backing of the Bank of England, a symbol of financial expertise, reliability, and trustworthiness. In 1968, Singapore was a third-world country. Foreign bankers needed to be assured of stable social conditions, a good working and living environment, efficient infrastructure, and a pool of skilled and adaptable professionals. We also had to convince them that our Currency Board and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, were capable of supervising the banking industry. Both Kung Sui and I had decided in 1965, soon after independence, that Singapore should not have a central bank that could issue currency and create money. We were determined not to allow our currency to lose its value against the strong currencies of the big nations, especially the United States. So we retained our Currency Board, which issued Singapore dollars only when backed by its equivalent value in foreign exchange. The MAS has all the powers of a central bank except the authority to issue currency notes. The MAS has been professional in its financial supervision, working according to laws, rules, and regulations that were periodically reviewed and revised to keep pace with developments in financial services. We had to fight every inch of the way to establish confidence in our integrity, competence, and judgment. The history of our financial center is the story of how we built up credibility as a place of integrity and developed the officers with the knowledge and skills to regulate and supervise the banks, security houses, and other financial institutions so that the risk of systemic failure is minimized. We made a modest start with an offshore Asian dollar market. It was the counterpart of the Eurodollar market. We called it the Asian dollar market. Initially, this market was mainly an interbank market in Singapore that obtained foreign currency funds from banks abroad for lending to banks in the region, and vice versa. Later, the Asian dollar market traded in foreign exchange and financial derivatives in foreign currency-denominated securities and undertook loan syndication, bond issuance, and fund management. The Asian dollar market in 1997 exceeded $500 billion, nearly 3 times the size of our domestic banking market. The growth was stupendous because it fulfilled a market need. International financial transactions increased exponentially as trade and investments spread across the globe to cover East Asia, with Singapore as one of its key nodes. In the early years from 1968 to 1985, we had the field all to ourselves in the region. We attracted international financial institutions by abolishing withholding tax on interest income earned by non-resident depositors. All Asian dollar deposits were exempted from statutory liquidity and reserve requirements. By the 1990s, Singapore had become one of the larger financial centers of the world, with its foreign exchange market ranking fourth in size after London, New York, and only slightly behind Tokyo. Because of our success after the mid-1980s, other countries in the region vied to develop international financial centers, some offering tax incentives more generous than ours. The foundations for our financial center were the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and a stable, competent, and honest government that pursued sound macroeconomic policies, with budget surpluses almost every year. This led to a strong and stable Singapore dollar, with exchange rates that dampened imported inflation. In the 1970s, we had a brush against a big name in the City of London. In March 1972, Jim Slater, a highly regarded British investor who specialized in asset stripping, came to see me in Singapore. When Ted Heath became Prime Minister, the press reported that he had placed his assets and stock holdings with Jim Slater to manage in a blind trust. Therefore, Slater had strong credentials. I had met him a year earlier at a 10 Downing Street dinner hosted by Ted Heath. I welcomed Slater's participation in our stock market. Later, in 1997, Sway San, then our finance minister, told me that Slater Walker Securities had engaged in manipulating the shares of Hawpar Brothers International, a public-listed company in Singapore. They had been siphoning off the assets of Hawpar and its subsidiaries illegally for the benefit of certain directors and themselves, conduct which amounted to criminal breach of trust. They were cheating the shareholders of Hawpar and the other companies. Investigation into a big name in the London Stock Exchange, if not justified, would give us a bad reputation. Should he proceed against Jim Slater? I decided that we had to if we were to maintain our standing as a well-managed stock exchange. The investigation revealed a conspiracy to systematically strip off the Hawpar assets, and this was only the tip of a much larger and wider swindle. Slater Walker's criminal activities extended from Singapore to Malaysia, Hong Kong, and London, the final repository of the loot. They had used Hawpar subsidiaries in Hong Kong to purchase listed shares in Hong Kong, then sold them to Spidar Securities, which was wholly owned by Slater Walker executives who shared these ill-gotten profits. The men responsible were Jim Slater, Richard Tarling, the chairman of Hawpar, and Ogilvy Watson, the managing director. Watson had returned to Britain before fleeing to Belgium, with whom we did not have an extradition treaty. Slater and Tarling were resident in London. We sought the extradition of Tarling and Slater, but the British establishment did not extradite Slater. Instead, in 1979, after a 3-year struggle through the London courts, the British Home Secretary ordered Tarling's extradition on only 5 of the 17 charges, the 5 carrying the lowest penalties. Tarling was prosecuted and sent to jail for 6 months on each of 3 charges of willful non-disclosure of material facts in Hawpar's 197-2 Consolidated Profit and Loss Account. Years later, after he had ceased to be governor of the Bank of England, Gordon Richardson mumbled his regrets to me in my office that he could not help Singapore bring Slater to justice. The MAS reputation for being thorough and uncompromising admitting only financial institutions of repute was put to the test in the 1970s and 1980s when it denied a license to the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. The BCCI swindle affected nearly all the big financial centers by the time it finally ended. Incorporated in Luxembourg by a Pakistani, the bank's shareholders included members of the royal families of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. It had about 400 branches or offices in 73 countries in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and America. It applied for an offshore banking license in Singapore in 1973. We rejected the application because the bank was too new. It started only in 1972 and low in capitalization. It resubmitted its application in 1980. Again, the MAS would not approve. Its international standing was poor. The BCCI did not give up. In 1982, Van Enen, who had helped us establish the Asian dollar market, inquired about its application. Ko Bung-sung, who had taken over as manager of the Banking and Financial Institutions Department of the MAS, had been told by several central bankers that they had reservations about the BCCI. So when Van Enen saw me, I decided it was best to support Ko Bung-sung. Not deterred, the BCCI tried again, this time through Harold Wilson. There was something strange about his letter. His practice had been to sign off in his own hand, "Yours sincerely, Harold." This time the "yours sincerely" was typewritten and he signed himself, Harold Wilson of Revo. I decided he was writing pro forma, to oblige a friend. Dishonest operations of the BCCI led to enormous losses for other banks. When it was closed down in July 1991, depositors and creditors had claims for US dollars LL billion. Singapore escaped unscathed because we refused to compromise standards. The MAS also denied a license to the National Bank of Brunei, which was run by a prominent Singapore Chinese businessman, Koo Tek Puat. Koo bought the National Bank of Brunei and arranged for the Sultan's brother, Prince Mohammed Bolkiah, as the bank's president to write to the MAS in 1975 asking for a branch in Singapore. Another letter a few months later informed us that his brother, Prince Sufri Bolkiah, had been appointed executive deputy president. Because of Koo's apparent political backing by the Brunei royal family, the matter was referred to me by the MAS. I backed the MAS decision to turn it down in 1975 and again in 1983 when the bank reapplied. In 1986, the Sultan issued an emergency order to close the National Bank of Brunei. There was a run on its deposits and suspicion of irregularities in loans of $L.3 billion to Koo's group of companies. He had used the funds of this bank for his own activities, among them an attempt to get a controlling interest in Standard Chartered Bank of London. His eldest son, who was chairman of the bank, was arrested in Brunei. Banks in Singapore, mainly foreign banks, had lent a total of 419 million Singapore dollars to the National Bank of Brunei. Koo took 2 years to repay these debts. Through strict rules and rigorous supervision, the MAS under Ko Bung-sung helped Singapore to develop as a financial center. To meet the competition from international banks, the MAS encouraged the 4 largest local banks, known as the Big Four, to acquire and merge with the smaller local banks to become bigger and stronger. The Big Four were ranked by Moody's, the U.S. rating agency, as financially among the strongest and best capitalized in the world. In 1985, the MAS had to help manage a crisis in the stock exchange of Singapore, SES. Malaysian speculators, particularly Tan Kun Swan, had deposited the shares of Pan Electric Industries and several Malaysian companies with our stockbrokers as security for loans at a higher price than their actual market value, with an undertaking to redeem the shares by a certain date at an even higher price. When the stock market went down and they ran out of money, they were unable to redeem their shares at the price agreed. This caused several large firms of stockbrokers, members of the SES, to become insolvent. The SES was closed for 3 days while MAS officials, led by Ko Bung-sung, worked around the clock with the Big Four banks to arrange an emergency lifeboat fund of 180 million Singapore dollars to rescue the stockbrokers. Ko's efforts enabled the SES to avoid systemic market failure and to restore investor confidence. It was a messy business. To avoid a recurrence of such a crisis, we revised the Securities Industry Act to strengthen prudential requirements of stockbroking companies. This gave their clients better protection from default by SES member firms, which in turn incorporated themselves to increase their capital. We allowed foreign participation in SES member companies and also wholly foreign-owned companies that brought in essential expertise. Because of these prudent changes we had made, the SES was able to ride the Black Monday global stock market crash on October 19, 1987, when Hong Kong's stock exchange had to close down for 4 days. Another advance for Singapore's financial center was the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, SIMEX. In 1984, the Gold Exchange of Singapore expanded its trade in gold futures to include financial futures and renamed itself CIMEX. To win the confidence of international financial institutions, we modeled CIMEX after the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, CME, with its open outcry trading system. We also convinced the CME to adopt a mutual offset system with CIMEX that enabled round-the-clock trading. This revolutionary concept allowed an investor to establish a position at CME in Chicago and close off at CIMEX in Singapore, and vice versa, without paying additional margins. The U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission approved this arrangement. The mutual offset arrangement has functioned without hitches since the inception of CIMEX. In 1995, when a CIMEX trader, Nick Leeson of Barings, a venerable London bank, lost over $1 billion speculating on Nikkei index futures, he brought disaster upon Barings but did not affect CIMEX or cause losses to other CIMEX members or their customers. In 1984, CIMEX started trading in Eurodollar interest rate futures contracts and soon afterward, the Euro-Yen. By 1998, CIMEX had listed a range of regional contracts including stock index futures of Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Thailand, and Hong Kong. The London-based International Financing Review bestowed upon CIMEX the International Exchange of the Year award in 1998, the only Asian exchange ever to win this title, and the fourth time CIMEX had achieved this award. As our financial reserves grew with increased Central Provident Fund, CPF, savings, Singapore's pension scheme, and yearly public sector surpluses, the MAS was not investing these funds long-term for best returns. I asked Kung Sui to review this. He formed the Government of Singapore Investment Corporation, GIC, in May 1981 with me as chairman, himself as deputy chairman, and Sui San and several ministers as board members. Through Kung Sui's links with David Rothschild, we appointed N.M. Rothschild and Sons as consultants. They sent an experienced officer to work with us for several months to set up the GIC organization. We also employed American and British investment managers to help us develop our systems for the different kinds of investments. To lead the management team, we appointed Yong Peng Hao as the GIC's first managing director. He secured James Wolfensohn, who later became the World Bank president, as advisor on investment strategy. Gradually, they built up a core of Singaporean professionals led by Ng Kok Song and Tay Kok Peng, who came over from the MAS. By the late 1980s, they and their staff had assumed the key management and investment responsibilities. At first, the GIC managed only the government's financial reserves. By 1987, it was able to manage the reserves of the Board of Commissioners for Currency of Singapore and the long-term assets of the MAS as well. It was managing assets worth more than $20 billion in 1997. The GIC's most important responsibility was to allocate our investments between equities, stocks and shares, bonds, mainly bonds issued by the governments of developed countries, and cash. There are books to explain the principles upon which the markets work, but they offer no certain guide to predicting future price movements, much less to making assured returns. In the volatile world of 1997 to 1998, the GIC could make or lose a few $billion just by the yen falling or the German mark rising dramatically against the US dollar. Investing is a hazardous business. My cardinal objective was not to maximize returns but to protect the value of our savings and get a fair return on capital. In the 15 years since 1985, the GIC has outperformed relevant global investment benchmarks and more than preserved the value of our assets. However, Singapore's financial center was considered over-regulated compared to Hong Kong's. Critics wrote, "In Hong Kong, what is not expressly forbidden is permitted. In Singapore, what is not expressly permitted is forbidden." They forgot that Hong Kong enjoyed the backing of the British flag and the Bank of England. Singapore, with no such safety net, could not have recovered from so dramatic a fall as easily. It had first to establish its reputation on its own. Visiting foreign bankers used to tell me that Singapore's financial market would grow faster if we allowed them to introduce new financial products without having to wait until they had been tried and tested elsewhere. I would listen carefully but did not intervene because I believed we needed more time to establish our standing and reputation. After I stepped down as Prime Minister in 1990, I had more time to delve into our banking sector and had working lunches with our Singapore bankers. One of them was Lim Ho Kee, a shrewd and successful foreign exchange dealer who was managing a major foreign bank in Singapore. He persuaded me to re-examine our policies, which he said were overcautious and prevented our financial center from expanding and catching up with the activities of the more developed centers. I also had several brainstorming sessions in mid-1994 with other top Singaporean managers of foreign financial institutions. They convinced me that we had too much of our national savings locked up in the Central Provident Fund and that our statutory boards and government-linked companies were too conservative, placing their surpluses in bank deposits. They could have higher returns investing through experienced and well-qualified international fund managers in Singapore. This would expand the fund management industry and bring in more fund managers who in turn would attract foreign funds for investment in the region. My views on our regulatory environment and banking practices began to change after 1992 when former U.S. Secretary of State George Shultz, who was chairman of the International Advisory Board of J.P. Morgan, a blue-ribbon U.S. bank, had me invited to be a member of this board. Through briefings and interaction with J.P. Morgan bankers in biannual meetings, I gained insights into their workings and saw how they were preparing themselves for globalized banking. I was struck by the quality of the members of this board, which included the bank's directors. There were able and successful CEOs as well as former political leaders from every major economic region of the world to give them different inputs. I was useful to them because of my personal knowledge of our region. Other members brought intimate knowledge of their own regions or their specialties. I learned how they viewed Southeast Asia compared to other emerging markets. Latin America, Russia, other members of the Soviet Union, and the other countries of Eastern Europe. I was impressed by the way they welcomed and prepared for innovation and change in banking, especially with developments in information technology, IT. I concluded that Singapore was light years behind them. As chairman of the GIC, I had discussions on a range of banking issues with CEOs of the big American, European, and Japanese banks, and learned how they saw the future of global banking. By comparison, Singapore banks were inward-looking. Their boards of directors were mainly Singaporeans, as were the principal bank executives. I expressed my concerns to the chairman of 3 of our big banks: Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation, United Overseas Bank, and Overseas Union Bank. From their responses, I concluded they were not awake to the dangers of being inbred and of failing to be outward and forward-looking in an age of rapid globalization. They were doing well, protected from competition. They wanted the government to continue to restrict foreign banks from opening more branches or even ATMs, automatic teller machines. I cautioned them that, sooner or later, because of bilateral agreements with the United States or possibly World Trade Organization, WTO, agreements, Singapore would have to open up its banking industry and remove protection for local banks. I decided in 1997 to break this old mold. Singapore banks needed an infusion of foreign talent and a different mindset. If these 3 big banks would not move, then the DBS Bank, in which the government had a stake, should set the pace. After talent scouting in 1998, DBS Bank engaged John Olds, an experienced senior executive who was about to leave J.P. Morgan. He took over as deputy chairman and CEO to make the bank a major Asian player. Soon, Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation appointed as CEO a Hong Kong banker, Alex O. For over 3 decades, I had supported Koh Bung Song on restricting the access of foreign banks to the local market. Now I believe the time had come for the tough international players to force our Big Four to upgrade their services or lose market share. There is a real risk that they may not be able to compete, in which case we may end up with no Singapore-owned and managed banks to depend on in a financial crisis. Gradually I concluded that Koh, Deputy Managing Director of the Banking and Financial Institutions Group in the MAS, was not keeping up with the enormous changes sweeping the banking industry worldwide. He was too protective of our investors. I sought advice from Gerald, creating a financial center 81 Corrigan, formerly president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and Brian Quinn, formerly of the Bank of England. They advised me separately that Singapore could change its style and method of supervising the banks without any loss of rigor, and without increasing the risk of systemic failure. Major financial centers such as New York and London concentrated on protecting not the different market players or the individual investors, but the system itself. Corrigan and Quinn convinced us that stronger and better managed institutions should be given more leeway to assume risk. As I did not want to revamp the MAS myself, early in 1997, with the Prime Minister's permission, I involved Long in the work. He began meeting bankers and fund managers and mastered the workings of our financial sector. On January 1, 1998, when the Prime Minister appointed him chairman of the MAS, he was ready to move. With the help of a few key officers, he reorganized and refocused the MAS to implement the new approach to regulating and developing the financial sector. Long and his team changed the MAS approach to financial supervision. They did it with a lighter couch and were more open to industry proposals and views. With advice from management consultants and industry committees, they made policy changes that affected all parts of the financial sector. They took steps to promote the asset management industry and amended the rules on the internationalization of the Singapore dollar to promote the growth of the capital market. The MAS encouraged the SES, Stock Exchange, and CIMEX, Futures Exchange, to merge and free up commission rates and access to the exchanges. The MAS liberalized access to the domestic banking sector by allowing qualifying foreign full banks to open more branches and ATMs. It lifted limits on foreign ownership of local bank shares while requiring the banks to set up nominating committees in their boards, modeled on similar arrangements in many U.S. banks. These committees vet nominations to the board and key management appointments to ensure that capable people are appointed who will look after the interests of all shareholders, not just the controlling shareholders. The banks believed that a lighter touch in MAS supervision would enable them to be more innovative in introducing new financial products. Perhaps we should have made these changes earlier, but only after the MAS had demonstrated the strength of its system to weather the financial crisis of 1987 and 1997 to 1998 did I feel confident enough to move closer to a position where what is not expressly forbidden is permitted. Our cautious approach helped us weather the 1997 to 1998 East Asian financial crisis. Our banks were sound and not overextended. No bubble puffed up our stock market. It has taken us 30 years from the time we first launched the Asian dollar market in 1968 to establish our credentials as a soundly managed international financial center. From July 1997, when the financial crisis broke out in East Asia with the devaluation of the Thai baht, disasters devastated the currencies, stock markets, and economies of the region. But no bank in Singapore faltered. Investors were rushing to get out of emerging markets, under which Singapore was classified. When fund managers were fearful of hidden traps, withholding information was not an intelligent response. We decided on the maximum disclosure of information. To enable the investor to judge the value of our assets, we persuaded our banks to abandon their practice of maintaining hidden reserves and not disclosing their non-performing loans. Our banks disclosed their regional loan exposures. They made substantial additional general provisions for their regional loans, dealing with the potential problems upfront instead of waiting for loans to turn bad. Because of the competent steps the MAS had taken to deal with the crisis, Singapore consolidated its position as a financial center.
Chapter 6. Winning over the unions. 6. Winning over the unions. I started my political life fighting for the unions as their legal advisor and negotiator. By the mid-1950s, the communists had gained control of most of them, and both communist and non-communist unions had turned combative. To attract investments, we had to free unions from communist control and educate union leaders and workers on the need to create new jobs by getting investments. This was easier said than done. Given the communist hold on our unions, it was inevitable that we suffered endless strikes, slowdowns, and riots from the late 1940s to the 1960s. Between July 1961 and September 1962, we had 153 strikes, a record for Singapore. In 1969, for the first time since before the war, we had no strikes or work stoppages. How did we do this? Singapore's British-style trade union practices had been the bane of our labour movement. To counter communist influence, the colonial government brought in such advisers as Jack Brazier from the British Trade Union Congress. To draw non-communist union leaders away from communist influence, these advisers taught them all the bad habits and practices of how to squeeze employers for more pay and benefits regardless of the consequences to the company. At a meeting in July 1966 of the Army Civil Service Union of Workers employed by the British forces, I urged them to abandon these British union practices which had ruined Britain's economy. I admitted that I had been responsible for many of them when I was negotiating for the unions. At that time there was too much exploitation of our workers. But the consequences were so bad, adding to our unemployment, that I regretted having done this. For example, triple pay on public holidays had led to cleansing workers deliberately allowing garbage to accumulate before public holidays to ensure that they would have to work on these holidays. The purpose of public holidays was to give the workers leisure, but our workers wanted more pay, not more leisure. So I asked union leaders to update our trade union practices. To stress how strongly I held these views, I repeated chemistry in the presence of International Labour Organization officials and union leaders from the rest of Asia at a meeting of its Asian Advisory Committee in November 1966. I told our union leaders that they must not kill the goose whose golden eggs we needed. Our unions, I said, had been part of a political movement against the British. Political leaders, and I was one of them, had offered workers the carrot of independence, saying, "Come with me to freedom and I will give you what the British employer gives to his British workers." That promise we must now fulfill, but to do so, we had to re-establish supervision, discipline, and working norms to get efficiency. Each year 30,000 school leavers sought work. Our union practices, I explained, were forcing employers to become capital-intensive, investing in expensive machines to get the work done with the minimum of workers, as in Britain. This had created a small group of privileged unionized workers getting high pay and a growing band of underpaid and underemployed workers. If we maintained our cohesiveness and stability, and did not repeat past stupidities that had shaken confidence, we should overcome these problems. We needed new attitudes, the most important of which was that pay must accord with performance, not time spent on the job. The unions and workers were so shaken by separation and fearful at the prospect of British withdrawal that they accepted my hard-headed approach. They knew we faced an emergency that could threaten our existence as an independent nation. The National Trades Union Congress, NTUC, Secretary-General, Ho Si Bung, a PAP MP and an old colleague from my trade union days, protested against my policies, such as the abolition of triple pay for work on public holidays. He and his union colleagues had to respond to ground pressure to keep the rank and file on their side and not be outflanked by the communized union leaders. I had to override his protests but took care to meet the union leaders privately to explain my worries. These off-the-record meetings made them understand why I had to get a new framework in place, one that would make for a trim and lean workforce. There was one landmark confrontation with an irrational and ignorant trade union leader who did not understand the changed circumstances. K. Suppier was president of the Public Daily Rated Employees Unions Federation. In an ultimatum to the government on the 18th of October, 1966, he demanded settlement of all outstanding grievances arising out of an alleged non-implementation of a collective agreement made in 1961, wanting $L per day increase for his 15,000 daily rated workers. Suppier and I had worked together for many years from the 1950s in the old city council days. He was an uneducated man born in India, a rabble-rouser in Tamil, the language of Madras, and a determined and stubborn leader. Negotiating with him was disconcerting because he was squint-eyed and did not seem to be looking at you. He led a union, the majority of whose members were immigrant Indian unskilled labourers brought over from Madras by the British to do cleansing work. He did not understand that we were no longer in the happy, riotous 1950s when union power was waxing, that in newly independent Singapore, on its own and highly vulnerable, the government could not allow any union to jeopardize Singapore's survival. I met him and his union leaders. In a 40-minute exchange, I said I could consider a wage increase for the 1968 budget, but not for 1967. I warned that 7,000 of his members were Indian nationals who now needed work permits to continue working. If they went on strike, they could well lose their jobs and would have to return to India. Sapir was not impressed. Only 2,000 or 3,000, he said, were on work permits and he would go on with the strike. If the union was broken, then let it be broken by Mr. Lee. He accused me of having forgotten that I owed my position as Prime Minister largely to the trade union movement. Sapir called for a strike by the Public Daily Rated Employees Unions Federation on the 29th of December, just before the New Year festivities. I asked them to reconsider their decision and referred the dispute to the Industrial Arbitration Court. This made any strike by the workers unlawful and I issued a statement to draw their attention to this. The Ministry of Health implemented their new work system for cleansing workers in January 1967. On the 1st of February, 1967, about 2,400 workers of the Public Daily Rated Cleansing Workers Union, a member of Sapir's federation, went on a wildcat strike. A defiant Sapir warned the government that if the cleansing workers' grievances were not settled within a week, all 14,000 workers in his federation's other daily rated unions would go on sympathy strike. The police arrested and charged Sapir and 14 other leaders of the Cleansing Workers Union with calling an illegal strike. The Registrar of Trade Unions issued notices to the union and the federation to show cause why they should not be deregistered. At the same time, the Ministry of Health declared that the strikers had sacked themselves. Those who wished to be re-employed could apply the next day. This coordinated firmness panicked the strikers. 90% of them applied for re-employment. 2 months later, both the Public Daily Rated Cleansing Workers Union and Sapir's Federation of Unions were deregistered. This strike was a turning point in Singapore's industrial history. The way the government met it head-on won the support of the public. It triggered a change in union culture, from a defiant flouting of the law to reasonable give and take. I was able to swing public opinion round further. In a series of speeches to the unions, I prepared the workers for the changes we planned to make to the labour laws. We banned all strikes in certain essential services and made each statutory board have its own union. At an NTUC delegates conference in early 1968, I convinced them that industrial relations between employers and workers were more important for our survival than wage increases, and that together we had to get the labor movement into better shape by cutting out restrictive practices and the abuse of fringe benefits. I depended on them as leaders to create a new labor movement with a reputation for realistic policies that benefited workers. Recounting Britain's prodigal years of crippling dock strikes which led to the devaluation of the pound sterling in 1967, I warned, if that happens here at our harbour I will declare this high treason. I will move against the strike leaders. Charges will be brought in court later. I will get the port going straight away. The Singapore dollar will never be devalued and I think the people of Singapore expect this of their government. I spotlighted the selfishness of established labour. Cargo handled by the Port of Singapore Authority in 1967 increased by over 10%, but the number of workers employed did not go up because the extra work was all taken up by overtime. This was immoral at a time of high unemployment. I told the union delegates that we must rid ourselves of pernicious British-style trade union practices. For balance, I told a meeting of employers that they had to be fair to their workers if they wanted maximum effort from them, that where unions and employers were not in agreement on basic objectives, the result had been ruinous for the economy. I urged our employers to do their part so that our workers would put in their maximum effort to get maximum rewards, direct rewards in their wages and benefits, and indirect returns through government revenue by way of homes, health, education, and social benefits. Britain's announcement in January 1968 of the withdrawal of its military forces heightened people's anxieties. I seized that moment to make radical reforms to rid us of those union practices that had usurped employers' prerogatives and eroded management's ability to conduct its own business. After we won re-election in April 1968 with an overwhelming mandate, Parliament passed the Employment Act and the Industrial Relations Amendment Act that same year. Later, the Trade Unions Act was amended. These laws spelled out minimum employment conditions and placed limits on retrenchment benefits, overtime bonuses, and fringe benefits. They set out uniform provisions for rest days, public holidays, working days, annual leave, maternity leave, and sick leave. They restored to management the right to hire and fire, to promote and transfer, functions the unions had encroached upon during the years of industrial strife. They laid the foundation for industrial peace. We made it illegal for a trade union to take strike or industrial action without a secret ballot. If it did so, the union and its officers would be liable to prosecution. This stopped the practice of voting by an open show of hands where dissenters were intimidated into acquiescence. Sayar Mui Koch, a union leader and PAP MP, another old friend from my time with the unions, objected to the wide latitude given to employers to hire and fire, but accepted the need for unions to be less confrontational to create a better climate for foreign investments. I included safeguards against misuse of these powers. These changes in employment and industrial relations laws and practices brought tangible benefits. Within a year, in 1969, 52 new factories were built, creating 17,000 new jobs. In 1970, new investments added 20,000 jobs. Incomes increased. In 1972, we set up the National Wages Council, NWC, with representatives from unions, management, and government. Every year, using facts and figures available to the government, the NWC reached a wide consensus recommendation on wage increases and other terms and conditions of service for the coming year that would be affordable and would promote further economic growth. Its joint recommendations were accepted as general guidelines, with variations for the different sectors, for all union management negotiations. From its early years, all parties agreed on the principle that wage increases must not exceed productivity increases. The deep sense of crisis that prevailed made it possible for me to turn around union attitudes in a few years. The danger of an economic collapse because British forces were about to leave altered the mood and attitudes of the people. They realized that unless we made a U-turn from strikes and violence toward stability and economic growth, we would perish. I got management to undertake their new role of winning worker cooperation, without which productivity could not increase. Strict laws and tough talk alone could not have achieved this. It was our overall policy that convinced our workers and union leaders to support our key objective, to establish international confidence in Singapore and attract investments and create jobs. But ultimately it was the trust and confidence they had in me, gained over long years of association, that helped transform industrial relations from one of militancy and confrontation to cooperation and partnership. In 1969, Devon Ne returned to Singapore from Kuala Lumpur at my urging, to lead the NTUC again. He had stayed on there after being elected to the Malaysian Parliament in 1964. I needed him in Singapore to play a key role in maintaining industrial peace and persuading our workers to increase productivity and efficiency. It was an enormous advantage for me to have Devon as Secretary General of the NTUC. He coordinated and fine-tuned my policies and inculcated positive work attitudes. In the unions. As NTUC leader from 1970 to 1981, when Parliament elected him President of Singapore, he got union leaders to face the challenge of competition in world markets. Each time Winsemius visited Singapore, he with his liaison officer, Ngiem Tong Dao, would brief Devon on the economic and employment situation. Devon taught the union leaders the basic principles of economics and helped make the tripartite NWC a success. One problem he faced was the decline in union membership because of reduced union militancy. To counter this trend, Devon held a modernization seminar in November 1969 and convinced the union delegates of the need to modernize their functions to meet the changed environment. They set up several union cooperative enterprises. In 1970, the NTUC set up a taxi cooperative called NTUC Comfort, which helped to break the pirate, unlicensed, taxi racket rampant in the 1960s. It started with 200 Morris Oxford taxis and 200 British Austin minibuses paid for out of British loans from their aid package. By 1994, with 10,000 taxis and 200 school buses, it was corporatized and listed on the Stock Exchange of Singapore as Comfort Group Limited. To lower the cost of living for its members, the NTUC started a consumer cooperative in 197-3 called NTUC Welcome to run shops, stores, and supermarkets. Later, as NTUC Fair Price, it became a successful supermarket chain that kept prices of basic consumer goods near wholesalers' costs. NTUC Income, an insurance cooperative, began in 1970 with life insurance, then went on to motor insurance and other fields. It employed professional actuaries and experienced managers. Union leaders sat on the boards of directors to oversee the professional managers of these enterprises and soon understood that good management was critical for success. Renewing its leadership has enabled the NTUC to keep itself relevant to a younger generation of workers. When Devon resigned in 1981 to become president, Lim Chi-on, a 37-year-old political secretary, took over as Secretary General. He had worked under Devon after becoming a Member of Parliament in 1977. A first-class graduate in naval architecture from the University of Glasgow, he brought sound management methods to his union work. However, his interpersonal skills were not as good as Devon's, and misunderstanding arose between him and older union leaders who claimed they found him somewhat unapproachable. This was a problem I faced each time there was a change of generation between leaders. Chi-on was more than 20 years younger than Devon. The union leaders of Devon's generation were used to Devon and did not take to Chi-on's different work style. The basic problem was that the old leaders did not welcome a sudden infusion of young blood. At my suggestion, Chi-on had brought in several young graduates to help him. This added to the discomfort of the older union leaders. I concluded that it would be difficult for him to get on with them. Chi-on took this as a personal failure and resigned from politics in 1982. He went into the private sector, joining Keppel Corporation, one of our largest government-linked companies. He was a success as a corporate leader, and a tower of strength to Sim Ki-boon, who had retired as head of the civil service to be chairman of the corporation. Devon and I agreed that Ong Teng Cheong, then Minister for Communications and concurrently Minister for Labour, would get on with the older union leaders. He was in his 40s, 9 years older than Chi-on, and I believed there would be less of a generational difference. I persuaded Ting Chong to work with the unions. He agreed and by 1983 was elected NTUC Secretary General. He remained in the cabinet. It worked well since the unions had their interests represented and the government was able to take their views into consideration when discussing policies. Ting Chong, an architect trained in Adelaide University, has a good command of English. Being Chinese educated, he is also fluent in Mandarin and Hokkien, his mother tongue. He got on well with both union leaders and the rank-and-file workers. He took the NTUC into new fields, providing members with better leisure and recreational facilities. I had encouraged him in this, but he needed little encouragement. What he required were financial resources and political support, which I gave him. The NTUC expanded into health services, child care, a broadcasting station, a seaside resort hotel for workers called Pesa Ris Resort, and a country club, the Orchid Country Club with a golf course by Selita Reservoir. It also developed quality condominiums its members could buy. These new cooperative enterprises gave more union leaders hands-on experience in running enterprises. Successive generations of new leaders learned about good management. These clubs, resorts, and other facilities provided workers with lifestyles previously available only to the better off. I believed these facilities would reduce the feeling that workers belong to a lower order, excluded from lifestyles which only the successful enjoyed. To make them affordable, the government provided state land at nominal prices. For many years I had been urging the NTUC to set up a labor college. In 1990, with help from the principal of Ruskin College, Ting Chong established an Institute of Labor Studies to teach industrial relations and leadership development. When Ting Chong was elected president of Singapore in 1993, Lim Boon Heng, 2 years younger, then second minister for trade and industry, took over as Secretary General of the NTUC. He graduated in naval architecture from the University of Newcastle-upon-Tyne and had worked with the Union since 1998, where his good interpersonal skills had been a great asset. He brought in well-educated and talented young men in their 20s and 30s who had done well in universities abroad and had fresh ideas. This input of new blood rejuvenated the thinking and attitudes of union leaders and produced results for the unions. Like Ting Chong, Boon Heng remained a cabinet minister, formalizing a pattern of cooperation between the unions and the government that has served Singapore well. I launched a productivity movement in the early 1980s because I was impressed by Japanese practitioners. I encouraged NTUC leaders to work with management to introduce quality control circles, QCCs, groups of workers who together put up suggestions on how to improve work, save time and costs, and achieve zero defects. Progress was slow. Following Japanese company practice, QCCs whose suggestions resulted in savings or improvements had their photos displayed and were awarded small prizes or bonuses. The Japan Productivity Center helped with experts, training fellowships, training materials, equipment, and software. Every now and again I would speak at award ceremonies and present the annual productivity prizes. On one occasion, in 1987, after presenting a prize to the managing director of a Japanese company, I asked why his local workers were less productive than his Japanese workers although they used the same machines. His honest reply was that Japanese workers were more skilled, more multi-skilled, more flexible, and more adaptable, with less absenteeism and job hopping. Singapore technicians, group leaders, and supervisors were unwilling to undertake work that would soil their hands. In contrast, their Japanese counterparts considered themselves not as white or blue-collar workers, but as grey-collar workers. They would readily help operate and maintain machines and so better understood the problems of workers. Devon had been struck by the achievements of Japanese unions. He got 2 octopus-like general unions to reorganize themselves into 9 industrial unions. In 1982, Chi On, who was then NTUC Secretary General, initiated the change from industrial to house unions. It made for better communication between union leaders and workers, and leaders could focus on the specific issues and problems of their own company with management. In 1984, the NTUC, convinced of the benefits, adopted a resolution to support house unions. In most cases, house unions increased union membership. They encouraged openness and trust, and were good for labor management relations. However, in the 1990s, Boon Heng found that house unions did not function as well as they did in Japan. Singapore companies are too small, most with less than 1,000 workers, compared with tens of thousands in Japanese companies. Furthermore, unlike Singapore, in Japan, executives, university graduates, and other professionals can join unions. Singapore house unions do not have enough well-educated members for leadership positions. They have to depend on the NTUC for help when negotiating with employers. We have to find a solution to this problem without recreating the disadvantages of omnibus unions. These changes to unionism in Singapore were achieved with few strikes or industrial disputes. The maturing of the trade union movement and its leaders was helped by several dedicated and able officers I had seconded from the Government Administrative Service to the NTUC Labour Research Unit in 1962, after the Communist unions broke away in 1961 from the Singapore Trade Union Congress to form their own union federation, leaving the non-communist unions without sufficient skilled negotiators. One of the officers I sent was S.R. Nathan, who had been a social worker. He had good judgment and worked well with the union leaders. Nathan later became permanent secretary of the Foreign Affairs Ministry and our ambassador in Washington. In 1999, he became president of Singapore. Another was HSU Tse Kwong, an energetic doer who later became our income tax commissioner. They helped the non-communist union leaders in their collective bargaining and in presenting their cases in the Industrial Arbitration Court. They educated union leaders on the realities of economic survival for Singapore and in the process forged an NTUC leadership that was realistic and practical. Later, in the 1990s, I encouraged promising returned scholars to take up full-time careers in the NTUC to beef up its research and negotiating capabilities. With universal education and numerous scholarships, by then all the bright children of poor parents had made it to university. Able union leaders who rose from the ranks became few and far between. To maintain the symbiotic relationship between the PAP government and the NTUC, I encouraged the NTUC to get some MPs to work full-time with the unions, and to appoint others as advisors to various unions. These MPs raised union issues in Parliament. Such additions to the union's manpower capabilities made a qualitative difference. Without their disciplined intellectual input and their easy access to ministers, the case for the unions would not be put across in a way that would command attention and from time to time bring about a revision of policies. We have put in place a fair framework to govern industrial relations. Restrictions on unions' excesses are balanced by consultative and arbitration procedures through which the unions can protect the interests of the workers. The key to peace and harmony in society is a sense of fair play, that everyone has a share in the fruits of our progress. The NTUC's positive approach to problems helped reduce unemployment from 14% in 1965 to 1.8% in 1997. For 25 years, from 1973 to 1997, average real wages increased yearly by just under 5%. We suffered a reverse in the Asian financial crisis of 1997, unemployment increased to 3.2% in 1998. To regain our competitiveness, the unions and government agreed and implemented a package of measures that reduced wages and other costs by 15% from the 1st of January, 1999.